Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, 11-year-old Simon Miller knew he shouldn't be doing this with his 10-year-old brother James at his side, who had agreed to come here, on the condition, of course, that Simon gave him a month's worth of pocket money that was already lying in his piggy bank, that he knew his younger brother wanted extremely badly. But this intrepid nightly adventure had been more than James had bargained for, as a growing sense of unease seemed to permeate his every thought, which he tried desperately to brush away and dismiss, as worrying about things you could not see would only make him all the more fearful, so much so, in fact, that he'd likely lose his nerve and run all the way back home, which would be completely counterproductive. Simon was the older of the two boys, by about 18 months, and being the eldest, he didn't want to show his younger brother James the apprehension and disquiet he was secretly nursing, but he had known all along that this nightly adventure of theirs would be more than a little intimidating, for he had never been particularly fond of the dark, but tonight he would not allow the uncertainty that doused his mind with a burgeoning sense of trepidation to stall his plans for the night ahead. He'd been longing to do this for a couple of weeks now, and nothing could possibly go wrong tonight, or could it? It would seem making their way down the sprawling woodland paths that divided the neighbour's property from their own was about the easiest way possible to access the Van Rensburg house, without being seen, of course. This rather useful shortcut of trees that proved to be very handy during the day, and was easily accessed without any concerns, had become a lot more discomposing for them at night, when the woodland oasis seemed to sing a completely different tune, for the atmosphere had dramatically changed, so much so that this benevolent grove of trees that the boys knew and loved so well wore a much more menacing demeanour, that left Simon and his brother James feeling a tad uncomfortable. James was clandestinely nursing his own anxieties, for like his brother he was afraid of the dark, and it had taken a great deal of bottle on his part to come here tonight to support his brother, even though he knew emphatically that what they were both doing was intrinsically wrong. But the idea of all that lovely extra pocket money crammed into his wallet had been an irresistible temptation that was impossible for James to refuse. He badly wanted to buy the vintage car he'd seen at the store in town, and now that there were only 2 left, it was all he could think about. So coming here, despite the fear that pressed down heavily on his heart, had not been an easy endeavour by any manner of means. But then again, nothing you really ever wanted in life came cheap. Everybody knew that, and it was one of his father's favourite sayings. Ostensibly, James was far too proud to let his older brother know that this little trip through the woods at the dead of night was proving to be a whole lot more terrifying and unnerving than he'd actually anticipated. The harrowing feeling of being watched by a pair of unseen, very menacious eyes had fed his imagination frenziedly, like a blood-sucking school of hungry piranhas. James had done his best to soothe his overactive imaginings by reassuring himself over and over again that nothing was there. But he couldn't shake off the ominously insidious feeling that they were both being watched by a pair of predatory eyes that burnt into the back of his skull like a couple of searing hot coals. He turned around nervously to stare behind him at the large labyrinth of trees that divided both properties from each other and stretched out over an expansive area of property. He was used to regularly visiting their best friend Boris von Rensburg by way of this wood grove that the boys used regularly as a convenient way of access. But at night this woodland oasis had taken on a cloyingly sinister, rather discombobulating atmosphere, which left icy cold chills running down the back of his spine and goosebumps unabashedly breaking out all over his flesh, for the menacing ambience suffocated all feelings of calm. "Get a grip," James told himself very firmly, over and over again. "I know the woods very well. I know them so well, like the back of my hand. It's just dark in here, that's all. That's why I'm scared. But buckle up. This adventure will soon be over, and then I can forget all about it. And once it's over, I will never have to do this again. And apart from anything else, I'll be able to get that wonderful vintage car I want so badly." His reassuring words offered little in the way of solace, as pretending to feel in control of your emotions is not always easy to accomplish, as James's nerves were seeping through the cracks of his flagging confidence at a rapid pace. He held his breath for a brief moment to suppress an inward gasp. He was certain he'd seen a shadowy, ambiguous figure staring straight at him from behind a tall, lofty tree. The silhouette had peered at him rather curiously, and then just seemed to vanish from sight, and he wondered if he'd actually seen it at all. He suspected that his impressionably suggestive, fertile imagination was duplicitously playing tricks on him. He reminded himself that his brother Simon would soon be giving him a month's worth of pocket money that he'd saved up in his piggy bank at home. And when he got that money, he would definitely be able to buy that vintage sports car he liked so very much. So much that the owner of the shop, Mr. Eric Reisman, had said he only had 2 models of the specialty cars left, and that they could no longer order any more, as the vintage line was going out of production. So this car would almost certainly be a collector's piece one day, if it was looked after well enough, so it was a worthy investment. James had wanted that sports car so much that he'd even asked his mother if he could have an advance loan on his pocket money to buy it, but his mother, Janice Miller, who was not one of those mothers who gave in to her children's fanciful whims, had said absolutely not. "It doesn't work like that, James. If you want something badly enough, you need to save for it yourself." "But, Ma'am, Mr. Reisman told me that when those vintage cars are finally sold out, there will be no more produced. There's only 2 left, and they could be sold any day now." Mrs. Miller did not have much sympathy for James's plight, for she did not see the world through a young boy's eyes, and was often inclined to be tactlessly unsympathetic. "Well, that's not my problem, is it, James? You were the one that bought all those sweets last month, so it's no wonder you've got no pocket money saved up. At least your brother is more vigilant like that. If you can't afford to buy that car, it's not my problem, is it?" It would seem, for James coming here tonight had been a no-brainer. He desperately wanted that vintage car to add to his collection, and if it meant walking over hot coals or breaking into a bank vault in order to get it, he'd probably have done so. And if that was the case, he told himself firmly, why was he allowing himself to be nervous about this trek through the woods? Why should he let it intimidate him? He was used to walking in the woods during the daytime. It was during the witching hour the woodgrove was like an altogether different world to the prepossessing place it appeared to be during the day. But James told himself to focus on the path ahead, and not to allow any intrusive thoughts to filter into his imagination. But sometimes thoughts have a mind of their own, like an out-of-control bull terrier that you cannot rein in, no matter how hard you try. Finally, both boys had reached their due destination, but it wasn't over yet. They were standing in the Van Rensburg backyard, but James reminded himself that their adventure still was not complete. They still had to go back the way they'd come, so he had to brace himself for the next few harrowing minutes or so that seemed to stretch out before him like an elastic band, with no beginning and no end. By all accounts, when you were doing something you knew was not right, it seemed to make every second feel like 1,000 lifetimes that were already lived. James was terrified of confrontation of any kind, of being caught red-handed, doing something you know you shouldn't be doing, or having to account for what they'd done. He envisaged prison gates made of steel, with nasty spikes that could tear a man in half, if daring to escape. He could imagine a maximum security prison, nasty police officers with formidable glares and angry scowls, dressed in bulletproof armour, carrying mace in their hands and hefty handcuffs. He imagined dingy, oppressive prison cells, darker and more tenebrific than the woods themselves. He imagined bunk beds with holey blankets and smelly toilets. He envisaged himself wearing an orange jumpsuit. In his mind's eye he could see his mother visiting him in prison, with tears gathering in her eyes, saying, "How could you do this to me, James? I am so humiliated and so desperately embarrassed. You have completely broken my heart. I never knew you were capable of such evil." James begged the haunting flashes of a potential mortifying grim future to go away, but they kept beckoning to him. "Leave me alone," he told his thoughts. He tried to swat them away like mosquitoes, but they kept nagging at his mind. "What if you get caught?" they whispered. "What if you get caught?" "I'm not going to get caught!" James screamed back at the thoughts in his head. They were here now. There was no point in backtracking on their plans. James's brother Simon appeared to be staring at the rabbit hutch for a long moment. A couple of rabbits nonchalantly tucked into a piece of carrot, and at first did not appear to notice the two shadowy figures peering into the hutch at them. All Boris's rabbits were extremely well fed and sizable, as being oversized appeared to run in the Van Rensburg family, although Nina Van Rensburg, Boris's tiny mother, was the exception to the rule in that regard. To all intents and purposes, it would seem Simon was caught up in a bubble of self-reflection. He was suddenly hit with an attack of the guilts, the nagging, uncomfortable reminder that warned him rather fiercely that what he was doing was not right. The words, "Thou shalt not steal," rang into his head like a resounding bell. If his mother were to see him right now, she'd be bitterly disappointed in him. He was stealing something that wasn't his to take, but he couldn't help himself. The temptation to do this was so immensely strong, there was no way he could possibly overcome it. Finally, with what seemed like a degree of wavering trepidation, accompanied by a pair of unsteady, trembling fingers, Simon hastily opened the combination lock of the rabbit hutch. Simon had seen Boris use the numbers of his birth date to get into the hutch, probably because they were numbers that his friend wouldn't forget so easily. Simon twisted the lock, turning the numbers together in a perfect sequence, and the lock clicked open. It had been that easy. The tenebrific night that stretched out before them, like an all-encompassing carpet that blasted out the light so cruelly, so that the world around them was drawn in a squiggle of dark shadows that on the landscape looked like a plethora of vague cardboard cutouts, devoid of any definition. This made the clinging atmosphere of the night stick to them like the fibres from a spider web, and it felt inauspiciously foreboding, which had been very intimidating for the two young boys, who had almost certainly lost their courage to come here tonight. But somehow their resolute determination had won through, and now there was no going back, for the script was being written in permanent marker. James hid his lack of confidence behind a brave veneer, which was the antithesis to how he had actually felt tonight. His father had once told him that even when doing something that makes you terribly afraid, always put on a smile on your face and pretend all is well, and then the thing you're doing will not feel so desperately daunting. James did just that. He plastered a smile on his face that made him in the darkness, with his pale white skin, look almost manic, like one of those demonic clowns you see in the horror movies. One brown and white rabbit was twitching its nose. It sniffed James through the chicken wire of the hutch and appeared extremely friendly. James looked at the cute rabbit cocooned in its safe little enclosure, surrounded by 19 other rabbits. He was suddenly struck with an attack of conscience that hit him like a fierce blast of lightning, as the little voice he'd been hearing all evening came rushing back and whispered warningly, "Don't do this, James! Don't do it! It's wrong!" "Simon," he said nervously, "are you sure we should be doing this?" He began to look around himself nervously, as if he expected to see the gargantuan figure of Mr. Louis van Rensburg waddling out of the house, waving the cane in his hand he often used to help his ample form balance a little better. The man was so large it was difficult for him to move around without a little help. But if he carried on expanding at this rate, he'd end up in a wheelchair. James knew how irate Mr. Rensburg might become if he found his son's two best friends from next door fumbling around with their rabbit hutch at this time of night. If he was to see them, his booming voice would travel for miles around, for it was as large as the man himself, and extremely intimidating. "Of course we should be doing this," Simon whispered indignantly, his face almost becoming cross with his brother's inappropriate remarks that he didn't want to be hearing right now. He didn't need his brother's discouraging words to claw at his conscience and make him feel bad about what they were doing. Simon scowled at his brother. "Do you think it's fair we have 3 piddling rabbits that are stunted in growth, and that Boris has 20 sizable rabbits in his hutch? He doesn't need so many rabbits, does he? But our 3 could do with more friends. Why do you think there is such a thing as rabbit warrens? Rabbits like hanging around in large groups, everybody knows that. But try telling that to Mum. If Mum wasn't so tight, then we could have more rabbits, and we wouldn't have to be doing this. But she refuses to buy us any more, so this is the next best option for us. Anyway, Boris has far too many rabbits. Taking 2 of them is no big deal. But Mum thinks our 3 rabbits are more than enough for us to take care of. That's why she won't buy us any more," James insisted. "We've got 3 rabbits, James," said Simon sternly. "I may remind you that Boris has 20, and if he misses 1 or 2 rabbits, it's no skin off his nose. Besides, that mother of his will get him more, so he won't lose out anyway. You know what she's like. She's a complete pushover when it comes to Boris. He bosses his own mother around all the time, telling her what to do, and his mother refuses him nothing. He's a spoilt brat, that's what he is, and has his mother tightly wrapped around his big, fat, gluttonous finger. It's pathetic. Imagine if we spoke to Mum like he speaks to his mother. We'd probably be grounded from leaving the house for months on end, let alone weeks. Boris doesn't know how lucky he is to have a mother that gives in to his every whim. If our mother was like that, we'd have 30 rabbits, never mind 20, and a brand new rabbit enclosure that would outrival Boris's. Mum says Boris is spoilt and she doesn't want us becoming like him," said James. "I wouldn't like to be like him. He's smug, he's self-centered, he's lazy, he's conceited, and I don't think he even cares about his rabbits. He just likes being the kid that has everything, so he can show off to everybody." "There you go. That's all the more reason why it's not going to hurt Boris to lose a couple of his rabbits. In fact, it might teach him a good lesson, that sometimes even Boris can't have everything in life. Simon, don't you get it? That's the problem. Boris does have everything. Well, then I prove my point. If Boris loses a couple of rabbits, it's no big deal to him. He'll just get more, as I was saying." Simon was definitely not going to backtrack from this plan of his. He had thought about it long and hard. Boris didn't deserve to have so many rabbits, and it certainly wouldn't hurt him to lose 1 or 2 of them, as he kept reiterating to his brother James, who didn't seem convinced by his earnest persuasions. For Simon, listening to his brother harping on about the fact that they shouldn't be doing this, was not making things any easier for him. "But are you sure we should be doing this?" said James, repeating the same question all over again, somewhat robotically. The uncertainty was very discernible in his voice. "Think about it, Simon. What if Boris wakes up tomorrow morning and comes to the hutch and counts his rabbits individually, one by one? He'll notice at once that a couple of his rabbits are missing, and maybe he'll suspect us of stealing them. I would suspect us if I were him. He knows we are upset that he has so many more rabbits than we do. He also knows we're jealous. He said as much. I don't think we hid our feelings well. And we didn't hide the fact that we don't think it's fair he's got so many more rabbits compared to us. It didn't help, Simon, a couple of weeks ago. You asked Boris if he'd give us a couple of his rabbits, and he told us that no, there was no way he would ever do that. It wouldn't be difficult for Boris to connect the dots and figure out that we had a motive to pinch a couple of his rabbits. What if he demands to see the 3 rabbits currently in our hutch, and asks why we now have 5 instead of 3? 2 that he thinks look startlingly familiar. Maybe he will recognize the rabbits we've stolen from him. He probably knows all his rabbits, even though he doesn't name any of them, which is decidedly weird if you ask me." "Oh, don't worry about that," said Simon, tapping his nose. "I've thought of everything. Boris won't see our extra 2 rabbits, because you're right. He would recognize them. Then he'd accuse us of both being thieves. I think he will likely suspect we took them, but at least he won't be able to prove a thing. I'll put the 2 rabbits in the old hutch at the back of the shed, the one that Grandpa used for his pet guinea pigs. It's still functional, so we can hide our 2 rabbits we've taken in there. Boris, when he visits, he'd never go looking for the rabbits on the property. He's far too lazy and unfit. He's always getting out of breath, doing the slightest bit of exercise, because he's so fat. I bet when he gets to his dad's age, he'll be even bigger than he is. I just don't want the 2 of us getting into any trouble, that's all," said James apprehensively. "Just imagine if Boris tells Mum 2 of his rabbits are missing. Supposing she suspects us of stealing them." "Oh, don't be such a sissy," said Simon, snorting contemptuously at his brother James. "I've paid you big bucks to come here tonight, so I don't expect you to complain. If it weren't for me, you could kiss goodbye to getting that vintage car model you want so badly. Besides anything else, you don't know what you're talking about. Mum would never believe we stole Boris's rabbits. She'll think the rabbits must have escaped from Boris's hutch and run away into the woods. She'd never think we pinched them. Never. Well, I hope you're right, Simon. You seem pretty sure of yourself. You're not paying me big bucks, by the way," said James in disgust. "It's just a month's worth of your pocket money in savings, that's all. Well, it's a lot of money for me, and I'm giving it up to you so you can buy that vintage car. So quit complaining, will you?" "I'm not complaining," said James indignantly. "I'm here, aren't I, doing what you asked me to do? I'm just saying, think about this idea of yours before you rush into things too hastily and start nursing regrets in the morning. I'm not going to regret doing this. I promise you, James, of that," said Simon insistently. Simon did not need his brother James reminding him that what they were doing was wrong. He'd rather not think about that. Life wasn't fair at the best of times, and sometimes it didn't do any harm to tip the scales of favour in their direction for a change. Boris van Rensburg had everything that money could buy, and more besides. It was disgusting how spoilt he'd become. These days their friend was like a greedy fledgling in a nest, with his beak permanently hanging open, waiting for it to be filled by 2 exhausted, overworked parents, who gave him all the biggest and fattest grubs he desired, that they struggled to get down his gullet. And even when he was stuffed to bursting point, he still seemed to want more. Because as far as Boris van Rensburg was concerned, he never had enough. The pastor at their local church would preach sermons about such people, mega wealthy corrupt billionaires in our society, who had acquired enough money to last many lifetimes, people who were involved in drug cartels and child trafficking, for example, but still wanted more and more wealth, for they were never satisfied with their iniquitous gains, for it was never enough for them. As far as Simon was concerned, The same could be said for Boris, although if the truth be told, you couldn't really compare Boris to a corrupt billionaire. But even so, every year Boris's life appeared to expand, with more and more things in it, as much as his waistline did. It was hardly Simon's fault that his very ungenerous mother believed that he and his brother James had more than enough rabbits in their hutch, even though 3 seemed a pitiful amount compared to Boris, who had acquired 20 rabbits. It was the Miller family that had got their rabbits first, and when Boris had seen that Simon and James had acquired a rabbit hutch with 3 rabbits, the very next day Nina van Rensburg, Boris's mother, had brought Boris a much larger hutch with over 20 rabbits in it, as Boris loved to overshadow his 2 next-door neighbours. He liked to say to Simon and James, "Look at me! I've got a much bigger and more impressive hutch than you. It's much fancier than yours, and I've got over 20 rabbits. You've only got 3. Ostensibly, if the Millers got new bicycles, the very next day Boris would have a more expensive, fancier bike than theirs, even if he couldn't ride it. It was like he got some kind of macabre satisfaction from having better things than the Miller kids, and he enjoyed showing off. Simon didn't care about the material things that Boris acquired. It was the rabbits in Boris's hutch that made him insanely jealous, as Simon loved animals, and wanted more than anything in the world to have more than 3 rabbits in their hutch, and had decided that 5 would be a very nice number indeed. Boris's nauseating mother Nina gave in to his every whim, and Boris seemed to enjoy having a mother he could easily manipulate. "My mother lets me have whatever I want. But your mum, well, she's really mean, isn't she? I'm so glad my mum isn't like yours." His words had hit hard, but it was true to a certain extent. Janice Miller was not exactly the most generous of mothers, whereas Boris's mother, Nina van Rensburg, was a complete pushover in every regard. She was like putty in Boris's hands, that he could malleably mould to do for him whatever he liked. Simon believed that Boris was like a self-entitled Maharaja in an Indian palace, sitting on his golden throne, waving his hand around as he ordered the servants. "I want 3 helpings of tapioca pudding, 5 Boston pies," he would lightly cry out, and the servants would adorn him with his heart's desires, refusing him nothing. Boris was useless at school, ate far too many Boston cream pies, along with ceaseless bowls of tapioca pudding, and as a result was constantly getting his clothes enlarged to accommodate his ever-expanding waistline. He was always getting ceaselessly praised by his mother Nina for being so pathetically useless and not lifting a finger around their house to help her. It wasn't fair that Boris got a huge amount of pocket money every week compared to James and Simon. He got 0 chores to do around the house. He didn't even have to make his bed in the morning, nor clear the mess up in his bedroom, and Boris was exceedingly untidy. He left messy puddles of clothes all around his bedroom, complaining bitterly that most of the clothes he wore were either too small or made him look fat, and Mrs. van Rensburg would run around him and tell him that no, of course he didn't look fat, and he was very handsome, and a young man at that, and not to worry, she'd buy him some new clothes that fitted much better. Nina van Rensburg was a tiny, rather nondescript woman, who was very slender and small-boned. She looked delicate in stature and size next to her oversized husband and son. Mr. Louis van Rensburg was a big, burly man, of sizable proportions, who had once been a formidable wrestler, but had continued to eat the excessive amount of calories he once enjoyed when he was rippled with muscle and in the peak of fitness, so his huge muscles had turned into fat, and his face supported several chins that wobbled underneath his face, along with big rolls of blubber around his middle, and every year he appeared to get bigger and bigger and bigger. He always had to turn at an odd angle just to get through the front door. Simon and James had met him a few times, but he was always in a grumpy mood, and seemed to be somewhat aggressive in his behaviour towards the Miller kids when they came around to play with his precocious son. It was like he didn't like kids at all, and found them to be a tad annoying. Boris had confirmed to the Miller kids what they had suspected all along, and that was that Mr. van Rensburg had become somewhat crabby and bad-tempered in recent years, especially after he retired from wrestling, for he no longer had an outlet to let off his steam. Simon and James liked to keep their distance from Mr. van Rensburg whenever he was around, for his baritone voice would boom, and the whole van Rensburg house would wobble and shake under its mere vibration. Boris could be extremely rude to his mother, but she never batted an eyelid when he spoke to her like this. She would allow him to become a quintessential spoilt brat, who had become repugnantly overindulgent. It was pathetic to see how Nina van Rensburg idolized her son Boris, and dotingly put him on a pedestal, almost as if he was some kind of demigod, which Boris most certainly was not. Simon Miller was certain that Nina van Rensburg probably treated her husband Louis in the same pathetically over-adoringly and doting manner as she did her son Boris. Whenever she came over to the Miller house for tea to spend time with their mother, Nina van Rensburg would harp on and on about how her husband had been the most formidable wrestler back in the day. It was like she was hanging on to those old memories of the past, as if they were still very current. She clearly still considered her husband Louis to be a celebrity of note, that everybody should naturally adore, which was somewhat endearing. She would have stars in her eyes that would mist up with a wistful nostalgia when she talked fondly about the times her husband Louis had done serious damage to some of his wrestling opponents, breaking noses and jaws and everything else besides. She seemed to relish talking about Louis van Rensburg's accomplishments in this regard. She'd giggle like a teenager with a serious crush. "Louis wasn't known as the grizzly bear for nothing, you know," she would say. "Everyone knew when they saw my husband that he could do some serious damage. Many wrestlers were completely intimidated by him before they even stepped into the ring, because Louis had quite the reputation back then. And his body was so incredibly ripped. You should have seen the muscle on him. It was so impressive." "Did he now?" Janice Miller would say, a look of disbelief almost clouding her face, for it was impossible to believe that the beluga whale living next door could have fought anything, for these days Louis van Rensburg struggled to walk to the front door without his stick for support. "Don't look so surprised, Janice," Nina would say. "I'll show you some fabulous photographs of what Louis was like back in the day. He was an intimidating wrestler, let me tell you." "Now those pictures I would very much like to see," said Janice. "If he was as formidable as you say, Nina, it's sad that he doesn't do any more strength training these days. I'm sure it would do great wonders for his health, don't you think?" Nina van Rensburg sighed wearily. "Must we go over this again, Janice? You keep telling me that my husband needs to lose weight, but you don't seem to understand how difficult things are for him these days," she said, leaping immediately to her husband's defense. "Louis's metabolism is not what it used to be. Back in the day, he ate a huge amount of food, and he burnt it all up, but not any more." "Nina, what aren't you getting about any of this?" said Janice. "I mean, of course he ate a lot of food when he was a wrestler. They all do. But if he's carried on eating as much food as he did back then, it's not his metabolism that is the problem. It's just that he's overeating. I mean, honestly, I don't want to be rude, dear, but I've bumped into you in the supermarket on many occasions, and I cannot believe the amount of food you put in that trolley of yours. That could feed my family possibly for 6 months or so. Is it any wonder that he's so fat, if you feed him so much? Honestly, Janice, I really would appreciate it if you didn't take jabs at what I buy in my supermarket trolley. It's no business of yours. I suppose I deserved that, Nina. I am sorry. Of course you deserved that. Anyway, I don't want to talk about my husband's weight. I find it very upsetting," said Nina defensively. "I was telling you about Louis's wrestling days, wasn't I? And how he was known as the grizzly bear. and you so rudely changed the subject. Sorry, go on, Nina. When did you first meet Lewis? Asked Janice curiously, wondering privately to herself how a formidable wrestler such as Lewis, who was possibly a heartthrob back in the day, had fallen for such an unremarkable but very pleasant woman who had now become her close friend. Nina van Rensburg giggled again. She couldn't help herself. She loved talking about Lewis's wrestling days. I knew when I saw my husband Lewis all those years ago. I simply had to go out with him, she told Janice proudly. I'd never been interested in sports, you know. But when I was taken to a wrestling match with my brother Ivan, who was obsessed with wrestling at the time, I don't mind admitting I was secretly enchanted and overawed by Lewis's magnetism. Everyone in that stadium would watch him with wide eyes. His moves in the ring were so nimble, so effortlessly easy. He was so fearsome, let me tell you, and so incredibly big. And all the women, well, it goes without saying, they loved him to death. People would shout out Lewis's name in the ring, and clap and cheer for him all the time. And I would watch him in a stupefied sense of admiration that I simply could not shake off. I went back with my brother Ivan to the stadium to watch Lewis wrestling a few more times. I was secretly nursing a rather pathetic crush on him, probably like every young woman around who was imagining a life spent with the grizzly bear as much as I was. My brother Ivan thought I'd become interested in wrestling, when nothing could be further from the truth. Although I did love watching Lewis, get into that ring. There was something about him that was just so incredible, let me tell you. Goodness gracious me, said Janice. It sounds as if Lewis was really quite a catch back in the day. Almost as if all the women in the stadium were practically drooling over him. Oh, believe me, they were. Drooling is the perfect word to use. I couldn't have described it better myself, said Nina, trying to suppress a giggle. Oh, my goodness, she said, patting herself with a tissue that she retrieved from her purse, for it appeared she had broken out in an excitable sweat, as she was reliving the romanticized dewy moments of her young life when she first laid eyes on Boris van Rensburg. It would seem a light went on in her face that made the very dowdy woman suddenly look quite beautiful. Oh, Lewis was so handsome in those days, Janice. You have absolutely no idea. When I would watch him, I'm not exaggerating when I say this, I would tingle all over, and there would be butterflies flying around my stomach. I was sure Lewis would never notice me. There were so many much prettier women than me that were unabashedly throwing their knickers at him. So one day I brought a pair of my own knickers along with me, and secretly put my phone number and name on them in permanent marker pen. I didn't believe for a second I'd have the balls to throw my knickers at Boris, but I brought them along with me nevertheless, and hid them in my purse, waiting for a moment when I could suddenly just become extremely bold and do something that I would normally never do. You did? Asked Janice, her lips twisting with amusement, as she tried to imagine Nina stuffing a pair of knickers in her purse in order to throw at the wrestler. Oh, I did, said Nina, chuckling. I was a lot bolder than I am now. I'd never do something like that today. My brother was in quite the shock, when he saw me throw my knickers at Lewis, who picked them up and winked at me. My brother was horrified and asked me what I did it for. I think I went as red as a tomato, and my brother said, "You fancy him, don't you?" He then cracked up laughing at me and told me quite plainly that Lewis would never be interested in the likes of me. He said that guys like Lewis van Rensburg had a plethora of supermodels lining up at his door, and he could have his pick out of all of them. I guess I knew my brother was absolutely right. I mean, why would Lewis ever have any interest in me at all, with my mousy brown hair and very dull brown eyes? I mean, I've always known that I was pretty mediocre and ordinary in the looks department. Oh, don't be so hard on yourself, Nina. Don't they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder? Said Janice encouragingly. Well, it's a very good thing that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, because obviously Lewis saw something in me. I think he must have needed his eyes examining. Imagine my surprise when he called me a day later, asking me out on a date. You should have seen me. I was so excited that this very big, handsome wrestler that all the women thought was a great big piece of all right was asking me of all people, out. I thought all my Christmases had come at once. When I told my brother Ivan the great news, he couldn't believe it. He thought I was teasing him and winding him up. But I assured him it was true. He said to me, Lewis asked you out, but you're so ordinary. Why would the man be interested in you, when he could have the cream of the crop? Mrs. Miller's jaws had opened wide at this startling revelation. She couldn't think of anything more smutty or sleazy than throwing your knickers at a wrestler, but she tried to hide her amusement and secret admiration that Nina van Rensburg had had the brass nerve and summoned up the balls to do just that. Certainly if the boot had been on the other foot, Janice would never have thrown her knickers at any man. Politely she said, You shouldn't demean yourself like this, Nina. I'm quite sure you were a very attractive young woman back in your day. And you still are, of course, she said very quickly. But as I was saying, men are unique as women are. They like very different things in women. One man might find a blonde woman with big breasts very appealing, very sexy. Another man might be repelled by such a woman, like someone petite, delicate, flat-chested, brunette perhaps. In my experience, men like women in all shapes and sizes. So one size most definitely does not fit all. And you were clearly Lewis's type. There is no doubt about it in my mind. I'm sure that what you say is true. But if I'm being honest with you, I don't remember a time that I was ever eye candy for the men. So what Lewis saw in me, I do not know. I was pretty mediocre, as I keep saying. So I thought that Lewis must be as blind as a bat, singling me out for a date, when he could have had any woman he liked. So what exactly happened, Nina, when he called you? Asked Janice Miller, who always thoroughly enjoyed listening to romantic stories about how people met. She personally could not imagine Lewis van Rensburg ever being idolized by so many women, and she was sure, had she been in that stadium, she would have definitely not found the man attractive. But she didn't doubt Nina's story was true, so she kept these opinions to herself. Nina's face brightened as she recollected rather nostalgically her early dating life with her husband Lewis, and seemed to enjoy sharing some of her stories with Janice. Well, he said to me on the phone, Is that Nina Starson? And I said, That's right, it's she. He said to me, I've got your knickers. Thanks for throwing them at me. Do you want to go out for a drink? I said to him that would be lovely. He said to me, Were you the lady, the lovely, lovely lady, wearing the lime green dress with the pink daisies on it? I winked at you, if you remember. I said, Yes, that was me. And then he said, I've had my eye on you for a long time. I realized then he knew who I was. And when we met up, I just knew he was the one for me, Janice. He told me that I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen in his entire life. Can you believe that? When he said that, I'm telling you, I was in total shock, as no man has ever said that to me before or since. But he saw something in me that other men have failed to see. He proposed to me on our second date, would you believe it? I remember he went on the air talking about me on the radio and saying I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever beheld. So I think people were rather shocked when they saw me on his arm. I think they expected me to be a model, and I was anything but. And you accepted his proposal after 2 dates? Asked Janice, looking decidedly startled. I knew my husband for 3 years, you know, before we tied the knot. If he proposed to me after 2 dates, he'd have scared me away very fast. I was not going to rush into marriage, let me tell you, Nina. I needed time to get to know my husband first, before I finally knew we were right for each other. Call me old-fashioned if you like, but I've always been exceedingly careful about making any lifelong decisions. I've never been rash about anything. So I do envy you, Nina, for being bold enough to take the plunge in the way you did. Nina shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. I guess the course of true love is different for every person. I knew I wanted to marry Lewis, so I accepted his proposal at once. When you know, don't you? I knew there were women out there that were jealous that I'd caught the golden carp. And, well, I was the happiest woman in the world. For weeks I walked around with a permanent grin on my face, and let me tell you, my jaws were aching from smiling so much. Wow! I've never had that happen to me. I can't imagine smiling so much that it hurts, said Janice. I can assure you, when I first met my husband, I had no idea he was the one. How did your brother react when he knew you were marrying one of his favourite wrestlers? He must have been as pleased as Punch. Nina van Rensburg chuckled. Well, when I told Ivan that Lewis had proposed to me, his eyes were as big as saucers, and were standing up on stalks, let me tell you. He said, "But you are so plain, so very ordinary. Lewis can have any woman he wants. He can't have chosen you. The man's insane. But I'm not complaining. It'll be cool having him in the family. They have been close ever since, you know. Although my brother's very upset that Lewis has let himself go, so to speak, and is no longer involved in wrestling. When he comes over to the house, he tells Lewis to come to the gym with him and resume training. But Lewis hasn't got the energy for that kind of thing these days. His slow metabolism has impeded him in so many ways. Your brother was dreadfully rude, if I may say so, said Janice Miller in disgust. I can't believe he said all that stuff to you, about being ordinary and plain, I mean. That's not a nice thing for him to say. But Nina, if you love your husband as much as I believe you do, don't you think it would help him to lose some weight? Said Janice as tactfully as she could. Your brother Ivan's absolutely right, you know. Lewis is obese, and that's got to be extremely worrying for you. I mean, what if he's not around any more to see his grandchildren? And if he carries on that way, well, that's a very big possibility, because obesity kills so many people every year. And I'm sorry to say this, Nina, but your slow metabolism story just does not wash with me. It's the oldest excuse in the book that so many obese people use. If you don't mind my saying, Nina, and we've been friends for so long, I'm going to be perfectly blunt with you about this. But your son Boris appears to be going in exactly the same direction as his father. I know you might take offence to this, but you know, he's not eating healthy. And he doesn't play any sport. He's bullied at school, from what my sons tell me. And you appear to give in to his every whim. I know you love your son very much as I love mine. But sometimes when you love someone, you have to be firm with them. You have to learn to say no, no matter how hard it may be. I think if Boris was slim like my sons are, he'd be so much happier with his life. His weight is holding him back, you know, Nina, preventing him from being an active kid and all that he would like to be. And in my book, that is so very sad. I've never thought of it like that, said Nina. You're right. Boris is missing out on an awful lot. And I know he's not happy about being bullied all the time at school. He despises being so fat. He hates his body, you know. I see that sorrowful look on his face when he looks in the mirror at himself. But I always try to tell him how handsome he is, to make him feel better, of course. But he's not happy, Nina. as I've been telling you for a long time. Boris could be handsome if he lost weight. Very handsome, I'm most sure. You need to say no to him, Nina. I know it's hard, but you want the best for your son, don't you? I do, Nina van Rensburg agreed, tears trickling down her cheeks, which she quickly wiped away. I really do, Janice. Janice Miller really liked Nina van Rensburg. Over the years they had become the best of friends, but she knew that her friend was her husband's and son's enabler, and she wished Nina could understand the health ramifications of what she was doing to her family's health. Nina looked reflectful for a moment, and somewhat sorrowful. You know, Janice, how can I say this? But Boris can't help the fact that he's got a big appetite like his father. I don't want to starve him at his young age. When he's hungry, he needs to eat because he's still growing. Oh, I do think it is a slow metabolism, whatever you might say. And you're right, the kids at school do tease him about his weight. But none of it is his fault, and it makes me mad when kids are so cruel. But you're right, I should say no more often, but it's hard to refuse my son. I imagine he'd have a tantrum if I say no to him about anything. I mean, Boris is addicted to Boston cream pie and tapioca pudding. And he's very keen on pizzas, burgers and fries like most kids are. How can I possibly deprive him of all those things he loves so much? Janice Miller knew that it was unlikely that Nina van Rensburg would ever take any responsibility for overindulging her husband and son. But if she carried on in the way that she was, she'd probably kill the people she loved best in the world with her kindness. But at least Nina was starting to see that overindulging her husband and son was actually abusive to their health, and that their health was indeed declining. And if she could say no occasionally, things would dramatically improve in the van Rensburg household. But Janice doubted that Nina had it in her to take a tough stance as far as her husband and son were concerned. Simon would have loved a mother as easy to manipulate as Mrs. van Rensburg. How Simon wished with all his heart that his mother Janice would run around him and feed him up with Boston cream pies and tapioca pudding. But his mother would never do that, as she barely allowed her children to even enjoy any sugar, and the only time that James and Simon got anything sweet was when they were at the van Rensburg house, where Nina would give them so many delicious candies and cakes to enjoy, that if their mother knew anything about, she'd likely have a heart attack on the very spot. So the Miller boys were not forthcoming to their mother about how generous Nina van Rensburg was towards them when they went over to Boris's house for tea. Simon had once complained bitterly to his mother that she didn't fuss over them enough, like Mrs. van Rensburg fussed over Boris, and he told her in a whiny voice that it wasn't fair. Listen to yourself, Simon. You do sound very whiny. As far as I'm concerned, you should thank your lucky stars that I'm not like Nina van Rensburg. Look at what a spoiled brat Boris is turning into. One day when he goes out into the big wide world, let me tell you, he's going to have a very rude awakening when he realizes that other people aren't going to fold under his indulgent demands, like his mother so obviously does. Much as I love my good friend Nina, I don't approve of the way she's raising her son. The problem with spoiled children is that when they go into the world later in life, it's like a roller coaster ride for them, because they've never learnt the toughness of life, so they have no resilience whatsoever. So when someone in a business deal says no to them, they'll probably go into a corner and sulk, whereas someone who's used to being tough will find another way to negotiate and won't crumble at the first hurdle. Once Simon overheard his mother talking about Boris to his father, and he had eavesdropped on their conversation. His ears had been flapping that day. You know, Nina is such a good friend of mine, and I enjoy her company so much, I really do. But there are many things we both disagree on. The problem with Nina is she loves Boris to death, refuses that boy nothing. And there will come a time when it will come back to bite her, let me tell you. The trouble is she's killing that boy by overfeeding him. And he gets zero exercise. It's tragic, that's what it is." Tragic, Simon had privately thought to himself, after overhearing his parents talking together. The trouble was his mother didn't know the meaning of the word tragic. Tragic was being denied all the things your friends at school had that you did not. Janice Miller hated excessive extravagances, and she often commented that the other mothers at the local school indulged their children far too much. But she believed the worst offender of them all was, of course, her good friend Nina van Rensburg, who appeared to find the word no alien to her vocabulary. Sometimes Simon wondered what it would be like to trade places with Boris for a week or so, and to wear Boris's shoes. The kids could swap mothers for a week. He had smiled to himself at this thought, and imagined his mother ordering Boris around in their home, denying him any sugary treats. There would be no more Boston cream pies or tapioca pudding for sure. Janice Miller would make him go on a strict diet at once, and tell him to clean up his bedroom, and she'd probably enroll him in a gym membership almost immediately. By contrast, he could see himself seated on Boris's bed in the van Rensburg house on a Sunday morning, and having Nina van Rensburg dutifully bringing him big bowls of Tom and Jerry ice cream to eat for breakfast, as that was Simon's idea of heaven, as that is what he would definitely have asked for, if his life, like Boris, had been dappled with the gracious gift of excessive privilege. He imagined it would have been cool having a mother like Nina van Rensburg, but he'd rather keep his own father, as Atlas Miller was one of a kind. He had a great personality, was easygoing and carefree, and quite a demure, outdoorsy person, who had a very good relationship with both of his boys, and would regularly take them fishing and hiking. Louis van Rensburg, on the other hand, had never engaged in those outdoorsy pursuits with his son, as he was physically incapable of doing very much these days. The man was larger than life itself, with a cantankerous, sloth-like demeanour that could not have been great to live with, especially as he was inclined to be moody, and as Nina van Rensburg would say, he was often as snappy as a turtle. Simon had privately wondered how someone as kind as Mrs. van Rensburg could put up with such a disagreeable man like Louis, but some people said love was blind, and it was certainly that way for Nina, because she appeared to see Louis through rose-coloured spectacles, even when he was being downright disagreeable. It didn't take long for the door of the rabbit hutch to finally open. With his torch in his hands, Simon was searching for the rabbit he wanted. It was a particularly attractive rabbit, with very distinctive brown and black markings. It was cuddly, with a most affectionate nature, and from the moment Simon had laid eyes on it, he had fallen for it hard, and wondered how he could ever get to own such a rabbit, until he'd come up with his ingenious plan. He had decided to call his new rabbit Cottontail, as the rabbit had a white fluffy tail that rather reminded Simon of a fluffy cotton wool ball. It would seem that, like so many things in Boris's unremarkable life, he had been too lazy to name any of his rabbits, so how much did he even actually care for any of them? If Boris really did love his rabbits, why didn't he name them? He didn't bother to look after the hutch or feed them. Those chores were left to his mother, who took care of almost everything for her son. The only thing he bothered to do was let them run wild around the yard every afternoon for a short while, which he did religiously every single day. As far as Simon was concerned, every animal deserved to have a name, and he knew that he and his brother James would give Cottontail a much better life than Boris ever could. He would give the rabbit the kind of love that Boris knew absolutely nothing about, for the only person Boris appeared to love was himself. "I've got Cottontail," he said, picking up the sizable rabbit in his hands and running a hand down the rabbit's fluffy coat. "This is the one I really, really want. Won't you grab the grey and white one over there for me, James? I've had my eye on that one as well. It's got the sweetest disposition. I'm going to call him Flopsy Mopsy." Simon placed the two rabbits in the cat container that he'd brought along with them, that their mother used for their two cats when they took them to the vet's office for their annual vaccinations, which the cats hated. The 2 rabbits were both happily contained in the cat box, and didn't seem remotely phrased or bothered that they were being smuggled away, and were happily munching away at the sweet romaine lettuce and grated apple that Simon had put in the cat container, especially for them to enjoy. Simon bent down to re-engage the lock to the rabbit's hutch, and it snapped together very quickly. The 18 remaining rabbits, having been disturbed by the 2 boys, had suddenly become quite active, and were hopping around the hutch quite happily. Everything around them on this tenebrific night seemed disturbingly still, apart from the sounds of the rabbits tucking into their food. The Van Rensburg house was bathed in an uncongenial darkness, as the moonlight was cloaked by a swirl of dense cloud cover. There were only 2 outside lights left on, and their subtle illumination never so much as trespassed over this part of the backyard. So the 2 Miller boys didn't feel conspicuous, as the dark for the time being, while they didn't want to be seen, had become more like a friend for them than a foe. James realized that while they'd been fussing around the hutch, after they had successfully kidnapped a couple of Boris's rabbits, that something was profoundly off, almost as if the night itself was holding its breath, like the closed curtain in the theatre that is waiting to open in any given second, and reveal what lies behind it. James had a profound sense that something was going on, but he didn't know what it was, and that something might potentially happen on this night that was seriously going to make him regret having agreed to get involved in this foolish rabbit abduction scheme in the first place. But regret was not something he could engage in right now. There was plenty of time for that later on. He and his brother needed to make haste and leave the Van Rensburg backyard as quickly as possible, along with their 2 prized ill-gotten gains. Simon seemed to be procrastinating, as if he was still harbouring some festering doubts about what they'd just done. All James could think about was, "Let's get out of here now!" And he was about to nudge his brother, when a sense of foreboding suddenly overcame him. He realized to his horror that the sounds of crickets and frogs had become completely mute, which confirmed to him that something wasn't right. Everyone knew that the woods lost its voice, and the crickets failed to sing, when something consequential had rudely disturbed the serenity. But what had caused the unsettling disturbance? Well, it was anybody's guess. It could, of course, be something completely benign, but it felt for both Simon and James that the tall, lofty trees in the wood road had quite suddenly become almost hostile and vengeful towards them, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against them, whispering mean things about the Miller boys among themselves. In that profound moment, both boys were overcome with a sense of grave disquiet. Something felt decidedly off tonight, but neither James or Simon knew what that incongruous, irrational feeling was, or where it came from. Perhaps it was the guilt that they felt in doing something they knew was intrinsically not right. All of a sudden, a light in the Van Rensburg house went on the top floor, and they could see a dark, very sizable, shadowy silhouette standing in the window, taking up the entire square of the window pane. James and Simon were in no doubt that that figure had to be Mr. Van Rensburg. He was looking out on the lawn, almost as if he'd been alerted to their presence. A very invasive bright torchlight from the upper floor was suddenly being flooded all over the lawn, as Mr. Van Rensburg was obviously using his obtrusive torch from the upper window to watch over the lawn. But why had Mr. Van Rensburg woken up like this? For as far as James and Simon were concerned, they had not made any noise at all. They had made absolutely sure that they had been as quiet as church mice, as they sneaked on to the Van Rensburg property to the rabbit hutch. So what had roused Louis Van Rensburg from his peaceful slumber? "Get down!" whispered Simon urgently, tugging at his brother's shirt, so that James instinctively dropped to the ground. "Don't let Mr. Van Rensburg see you, or we're in big, big trouble." The 2 boys crouched behind the rabbit hutch and cowered, so they became one with it. For a moment the torchlight cast its bright beam around the rabbit hutch, and hovered for a while, as if searching for something that the night was hiding in its shadows. Simon was terrified that Mr. van Rensburg would see them, crouching over behind the hutch, making themselves as small as they possibly could to avoid detection. He could barely entertain the horrifying thought of burly Mr. Louis van Rensburg and his huge, indignant body, heaving himself out of the house, like a giant, very bad-tempered walrus, that was somewhat impeded by his great blubber, but still absolutely determined to purge out the secret that was hiding in his midst. Frankly, as far as Simon and James were concerned, it was a surprise that Louis van Rensburg had even been disturbed during the night like this. How could he even know that something was out on his property, when the two Miller boys had prided themselves in making absolutely no noise? Maybe some men had a sixth sense about such things, and went to bed with one eye half open, for perhaps it was ingrained in their psyche to be the protector of the family. And with Louis van Rensburg and his wrestling history behind him, maybe he was more tuned in to defending his family than most men in his position would be, as Mrs. van Rensburg had always boasted that her husband was literally born to fight. "Don't move, James," whispered Simon to his brother. "We need to stay low for a while, until the coast is clear. Mr. van Rensburg is up and about, so we need to be vigilant and make sure he doesn't see us." "But what if he does see us?" whispered James. "I knew we shouldn't have done this. I know he's going to find us. I know it." "He's not going to find us," said Simon. "But he will if you keep talking. Be quiet, James, and stay as small as you possibly can. We can't afford to let him see us." Moments later, lights on the lower floors of the van Rensburg house came on, and Simon's heart at this point was jumping around so loudly in his ears that all he became conscious of was the rapid rise and fall of his chest, and the dreadful certainty that he and his brother would be caught. If Louis van Rensburg caught them at the rabbit hutch, with two of the family rabbits in their cat box, they would never hear the end of it from their mother, who would probably come down on them so hard, and they would not be given any pocket money for an entire year, because Janice Miller could be as tough as old boots. She'd lightly ply them with even more laborious chores to do around the house, lecturing them intently that she didn't raise them up to become thieves. She'd lightly rant on and on about how humiliated and ashamed she was of their behaviour. Simon knew his mother could easily be provoked to anger. If she was upset enough about something, doubtlessly she would lay into him a lot harder than she would James. As him being the oldest, his head always tended to be on the chopping block first. She'd lightly say that Simon was a very bad influence on James, and maybe she was right, as James had not wanted to be involved in this Machiavellian plot in the first place. Soon they heard the bright red front door, with its gold impressive lion opulent knocker open, and a light being switched on. The light of Mr. van Rensburg's prying torch once again circumnavigated the back and front yard, as the oversized man waddled precariously around his property, calling out, "Is anyone there?" in his booming voice. Simon was certain that both he and his brother James would be discovered, but luckily for them, Mr. van Rensburg's ungainly, rather cumbersome body sabotaged his ability to properly investigate his property. He was heaving and wheezing from the slight exercise. Moments later they heard Mrs. van Rensburg's voice. "What are you doing out there, Louis? Go back to bed, will you? Do you have any idea how late it is?" "I don't want you to wake up Boris. He needs his sleep, and he doesn't need his father waking him up in the middle of the night like this. You made such a commotion going downstairs. I'm very surprised you didn't wake our boy up." "I thought I heard some strange noises," came Mr. van Rensburg's booming voice, that stole the silence in the yard with its baritone-like vigour. "But of course you heard noises," came Mrs. van Rensburg's voice. "There are lots of owls hooting out here tonight. I heard them myself while I was in bed, but it's nothing to concern yourself with." "You heard them too, did you?" asked Mr. van Rensburg. "They didn't sound natural, love. It was like some kind of cryptic code to me, as if people were out there hooting to each other, mimicking owl calls. Those were owl hoots, for goodness sake. Honestly, what are you like, Lewis? Those were owl hoots, for goodness sake. There was nothing sinister about them at all. Now come back to bed, will you? Your insomnia is driving me crazy. It's not doing you any favours. We really need to discuss this problem with Dr. Lambrose. He was saying your weight is the big issue here. If you lost just a few pounds, Lewis, maybe you would sleep a lot easier at night. Remember what Dr. Lambrose told you on our last visit. He said stop eating all those snacks between meals. He was blaming me for being your enabler. But I've stopped giving you snacks. I'm going to come clean with you, Lewis. I discovered all those empty packets of Cheetos in your trunk. There were over 130 empty packets. Crumbs all over the front seat, along with packages from Wendy's, Taco Bell, McDonald's, and God knows where else. You're overdoing it, love. You've got to stop. This can't go on. Are you going to go on and on about my weight again, Nina? Change the record, will you? I'm a big guy. I eat a lot. Get over it, will you? You've never been this big, love. You ate a lot when you were professionally wrestling. But Dr. Lambrose isn't buying the fact that you've got a slow metabolism. And come to think of it, neither am I. Not anymore. I'm sorry, love. But I worry about you. This insomnia you're suffering from is doing you no favours. Maybe you need to go to the sleep specialist. Or maybe eating those Cheetos is affecting your biorhythms. Janice Miller from next door says that all the preservatives in fast food can make you very sick and hold on to the weight, which is why I've started cooking you wholesome food of late to keep you substantially full. But if you keep putting all that crap into your body, all my efforts to make you healthy are completely futile. And that is the reason why your sleep is so chaotic and why you're up and about at this crazy time of the night. I'm not interested in what Janice Miller from next door has to say about my health. It's none of her business. I'm sick of all the salads you keep thrusting on me, Nina. I'm not one of Boris's bloody bunny rabbits. I'm a carnivore that enjoys big portions, thank you very much. I'll thank you, Nina, to keep your opinions to yourself and not share what I eat with our next-door neighbour. Janice Miller from next door is a nosy old cow. Her family is so lean because she denies them all the good stuff in life. I feel sorry for those kids of hers. They look like they could do with a hearty meal for once in their lives. If you must know, my sleep disturbances have nothing to do with my eating habits whatsoever. I was sure I heard something out here in the yard tonight, and those owl hoots were certainly disturbing to me. They didn't sound natural. Lewis, you're imagining things that aren't even there. Now come to bed, will you? Simon and James sighed with relief when the red front door finally closed behind the Van Rensburgs, and the lights to the house went out. Now was the time to break free from the Van Rensburg backyard, and allow the tall, lofty shadows of the trees to indulge their most urgent needs, which was to hide Simon and James from any prying eyes. The great thing about the night was that many iniquities could be covered over, like the fresh paint applied to a rusty wall, and no one would be any the wiser of what secrets the night had hidden in its grasp, for in the morning the woods would look innocently benign, and nothing would betray the lost secrets from the night before. As far as Simon was concerned, they had the 2 rabbits they had come for, so getting back home would be a walk in the park, now that they were finally away from the Van Rensburg house, and the obtrusive wanderings of Mr. Van Rensburg's intensely annoying torch. Once Simon and James had reached the woodland path, their fast breathing slowed down substantially, and their racing hearts subsided. Their youthful bodies, tight with anguished trepidation, were beginning to loosen up substantially from the sheer relief of having accomplished their goals. All they needed to do now was to get back to the house as clandestinely as they could, and make sure they did their level best to ensure that their parents were not awakened from their sleep. It had been a challenge slipping out of the half-open window in the living room, but the 2 boys were still small enough to wiggle through the frame. But in a couple of years such a feat would likely be close to impossible for them to accomplish. It would seem as they ambled down the woodland trail that was liberally scattered with leaves and twigs. Every noise their boots made as they crunched the leaf litter beneath them seemed annoyingly conspicuous, as if the woods themselves were vindictively betraying their very presence. James stopped short in his tracks, his face draining of all its colour. "Something is following us," he whispered. "Listen!" "Nothing is following us, you silly mutt," said Simon, unable to hide the notable irritation in his voice, for his brother James this evening had been more than a little annoying, going on and on about the fact that he believed something was watching them, and that they were being surreptitiously followed. Why didn't his brother just hold his tongue until they got home? Simon really didn't need James to press his anxiety buttons, which was exactly what he was doing right now. All of a sudden James stood still, waving his hand, gesturing for his brother to be quiet. Both of the Miller boys stopped walking and listened to the sounds of this fetching woodland oasis that tonight was wearing a dark gown that seemed menacingly foreboding, for the canopy of trees above their heads had swallowed the scant moonlight in one hungry gulp, so any leaked prisms of light were unable to willingly trespass through the trees, so everything was cloaked in a tenebrothic fog of darkness. Indeed, the lack of light was so bad that if the Miller boys had switched off their torches, they would not have seen their hands before their faces. Luckily, their torches were magnanimously bright in their illumination, so they were able to cautiously steal their way through the trees, like two ghostly shadows. But regrettably, the overwhelming sense that someone was closing in on them from behind had become almost insufferable for James. He had to say something, even though his brother Simon would not thank him for expressing any of his insecurities he was currently feeling. "Someone is following us," he told Simon, once again stopping short in his tracks, looking nervously behind him. I know they are. I feel it in my gut, I really do. I heard a twig snapping from behind us. Surely you heard it, Simon. Don't tell me you didn't. It was loud. It means someone is definitely there, that we're not alone. It's freaking me the hell out. I'm scared, Simon. I really am. Don't overreact, James. You always hear twigs snapping in the woods. It's pretty normal. Of course we're not alone. There are wild animals roaming around everywhere, even though you can't see them. It's dark in here. They're hiding in the shadows. You could possibly have heard a raccoon or a deer, and they're harmless, so it's no big deal. Get a grip, James, will you? Stop being such a scaredy cat and putting weird ideas into my head while we're trying to get home. James certainly didn't appreciate his brother's condescending insults. That always made him feel as if he was a big baby, and he hated people thinking this way about him, for it was demeaning. As being the youngest member of the Miller family, he always felt as if he was being patronized. As they neared their own house, the woods were flooded with a cacophony of owl hoots, and what was strange about these sounds is that although they did sound like owls, the calls were far too close together, and appeared to come from different parts of the woods, so they gave James the chills. He had heard Mr. van Rensburg saying that owl hoots didn't appear normal, and he said it was like some kind of code, almost as if the owl calls around the woods were being answered and sent out, as if their calls did not actually come from owls. But then who was making them? All of a sudden both boys heard the crunch of twigs and could sense something was moving closer towards them. And this time both the boys knew unequivocally that they were not alone. This was not their imagination teasing them mischievously. Something was definitely there, and whatever it was, the presence seemed sizable, even though the boys could not see a thing. In the darkness they heard someone clearing their throat, and at this point Simon was convinced that Mr. Rensburg had left his house and followed them through the woods. But he was so overweight, so desperately unfit, so enormous. How could he have possibly caught up with them so quickly? Why couldn't they hear him gasping and wheezing for breath? Now they were sure Mr. van Rensburg was standing there, watching them. Both boys realized to their horror that the larger-than-life man had caught them red-handed, stealing 2 of Boris's bunny rabbits. They had been cornered, so now they'd be forced to have to confess their sins to the man who would doubtlessly derive great pleasure from their humiliation, and they would have to return home with their tails shamefully tucked between their legs, admitting to their mother what they had done. Doubtlessly Janice Miller would be mad with the both of them, but their father would likely leave all the reprimanding to his wife, which was a dreadful pity, as Janice Miller could be fearsome at the very best of times. Simon was wondering what he would say to Mr. van Rensburg to explain their sneaky actions tonight, which doubtlessly would not amuse the man one little bit. As, let's just say, Louis van Rensburg was cantankerous and had about as much humour as an Australian duck-billed platypus. "We were just playing a trick on Boris, that's all," he thought he would say. "It was just a harmless prank. We wanted to give him a shock when he found his rabbits were missing, 2 of them, I mean. Then we'd have given them back to him." Simon wasn't sure that Mr. van Rensburg would believe his tall story, but in this quintessential moment, when his nerves were so tight they were practically squeezing the oxygen out of his lung, this was the only excuse that Simon could think of in the spur of the moment that might seem remotely plausible. To be fair, Boris had played enough tricks on both Simon and James. He'd once placed a very real-looking plastic snake in their rabbit hutch, and it had scared the bejesus out of the both of them. So they were only paying him back for that stunt. "Mr. van Rensburg!" Simon called out gingerly. "Is that you, Mr. van Rensburg?" The crackling of the twigs persisted, and then a branch of a tree close to them snapped, falling very suddenly to the ground. They heard a series of owl hoots, one so close it seemed like only a foot away. Then they saw him, standing tall and proud behind the tree, the enormous outline of a human-like silhouette that seemed disproportionately tall and lofty, but appeared ambiguously vague. But in the dingy darkness, Simon was certain that Mr. Rensburg was standing there. "I'm so sorry, Mr. van Rensburg. We didn't mean to do this. We were playing a trick on Boris, that's all. We were going to put the rabbits back, I promise you. It's just Mr. van Rensburg, Boris, well, he did a really horrible prank on us, and that scared us to death, so we're only getting him back for it. He put a realistic plastic snake into our hutch. We thought it was real. And we're just getting him back. It's just a prank, that's all." As he said that, the light of his torch washed over the figure standing behind the tree. Why wasn't Mr. van Rensburg's booming voice screaming out at them in indignation? His booming, outraged voice would be a whole lot more comforting than the suffocating silence that was cloaking them with a sense of unabating disquiet. Simon flinched in terror as he observed the figure that stood there. It was so gargantuan in size. And then he realized in horror that this was not Mr. van Rensburg standing there, but an imposing Bigfoot who could have been 9 foot tall. He let out a strangled scream, for the burgeoning fear within him had tipped the scales. For suddenly he was certain that he and his brother were in mortal danger, for the Bigfoot was so desperately intimidating. In a trice the Bigfoot vanished from their sight, and the woods were flooded with owl calls coming from everywhere, and that was when both boys knew the Bigfoot they had seen might be calling out to other members of his clan. What if he was calling for reinforcements, and they would be surrounded by several intimidating Bigfoot who might wish to harm them? The thought was so horrifying to both of the boys that, gripped by a horrendous fear, they ran back to the house as fast as they could, with legs made of jelly and hearts pounding violently in their chests. When the Miller boys finally reached their house, they scrambled hurriedly through the window, leaving a trail of muddy prints on the window ledge. They decided to leave the 2 abducted rabbits outside the window in the cat container and would deal with them in the morning, for both boys were too affrighted to dare venture out in this dark night, in case the Bigfoot was still out there. Worse still, there may be many more of these creatures wandering around, if those owl hoots were anything to go by. "Did you see it?" said James. "Did you see it? It was a Bigfoot." "Of course I saw it," said Simon. "Didn't I tell you something was watching us, but you didn't believe me, did you, Simon? You always think it's my imagination, don't you? It turns out I was absolutely right." That Bigfoot was stalking us. The size of him! I've never seen anything so big in my entire life. There's no way I'm going out there until the morning to put those rabbits into the guinea pig enclosure. I'm sure they'll be fine, unless the Bigfoot steals them and eats them. And if he does, well, it's just too bad. Maybe he could smell the rabbits and was hungry, said Simon. Maybe that's why he was following us. The following morning, Simon checked on the rabbits and was heartily relieved to find them safe and well in the cat box outside the window. He quickly put them in the guinea pig enclosure behind the yard shed, where he was sure they would not be discovered. It was as the Miller boys were enjoying breakfast the following morning, their mother answered the landline and came to the table looking somewhat troubled. That was Nina van Rensburg, would you believe, on the telephone. She says that Boris is in quite the state this morning. Apparently 2 of his rabbits went missing last night, would you believe? She doesn't understand how they got out of the hutch. The combination lock was secured, and no one broke through the chicken wire. But Boris insists they went missing. Apparently Mr. van Rensburg also woke up during the night, claiming he was disturbed by some very bizarre owl calls he heard. Boris apparently is desperately upset about his missing 2 rabbits. He wanted to know if you boys know anything about their disappearance. He was saying you might have played a trick on him to get him back for putting a fake snake in your hutch a while back, as a joke. And apparently it gave you both quite the scare. I didn't know anything about that, I must admit. I told Mrs. van Rensburg that you would never pull a stunt like that, would you? She said, looking at her 2 sons, with an earnest expression on her face. James and Simon's faces paled, and then Simon said rather too quickly, Why would we know anything about Boris's rabbits disappearing? Mum, he's got over 20 rabbits. He lets them frolic around the lawn sometimes. Maybe the rabbits went walkabout, and he didn't notice that they had gone, and put 18 rabbits back into the hutch instead of, 20. There are wild rabbits running wild in the woodgrove. Maybe the tame rabbits have integrated with them. It happens, you know. That's exactly what Mrs. van Rensburg believes. She says it was a dreadful oversight on Boris's part. But he insists he always counts the rabbits before he places them back in his hutch. But you're right. If you have so many rabbits in a hutch like Boris so obviously does, I imagine it's hard to keep track of all of them. Mrs. van Rensburg wants to replace the rabbits Boris lost, but he's insistent that he wants the rabbits back that have gone missing. But that's not going to happen if they've scampered off into the woodgrove to join the wild rabbits. I imagine they won't want to return to the trappings of domestic bliss. Not if they can roam freely and breed among themselves. And we all know how rabbits love to breed. It was after breakfast that James took Simon to one side and said, What have you done? Boris is having a hissy fit. I think he knows we've taken his 2 rabbits. That's why he's making a song and a dance about it. What if he comes around here and finds the 2 rabbits we took, hidden in the guinea pig hutch? Maybe we should come clean about it and tell him it was just a joke and give him back his bunny rabbits. I had no idea he'd overreact like this. I mean, his mother's offered to replace the 2 missing rabbits, but he's having nothing of it. He knows we have his 2 bunnies, and that's why he wants them back, Simon. Come clean. Are you crazy, James? I'm not going to admit to taking his 2 bunny rabbits, and neither are you. Believe me, he'll calm down soon enough, especially when he realizes we have nothing to do with their disappearance. We can play the innocent with him, act like we haven't got a clue what he's talking about. I've paid you the money that I promised you, James, so I expect you to keep to your end of the bargain. I promise you it'll blow over soon enough. Boris will calm down about his rabbits when some other fancy gadget he can't live without grabs his attention. Well, I hope you're right, Simon. I don't feel good about any of this. I'm sure Boris is on to us. I mean, he's not stupid, is he? As the 2 boys had predicted, Boris arrived at their front door a few hours later, very much out of breath. His whole face was red with indignation, and the jowls of his chin wobbled as he spoke. You didn't take my 2 rabbits, did you, Simon? he asked. "They went missing last night. I'm sure you've heard all about it from my mother." "We heard about it," said Simon nonchalantly. "Of course we wouldn't take your rabbits, Boris. So you're not playing a prank on me, are you? I told you I'm sorry that I scared you with the plastic snake. But stealing 2 of my rabbits is going too far. It's not even funny. But of course we didn't steal your rabbits, Boris. I'm sorry to hear your rabbits went missing. They're very tame. Maybe you'll find them," said Simon. "So you didn't take them?" asked Boris earnestly. "Of course we didn't take them," said Simon. "Maybe they strayed off when you let them out of the hatch. Maybe they're running around with the wild rabbits." "But I'm sure I counted them," said Boris in exasperation. "Mind if I look at your hutch, just to make sure you're not pranking me?" "But of course you can check out our hutch," said Simon, leading Boris to the rabbit hutch, and looking so very innocent that Boris was beginning to doubt himself, and feel a tad foolish for suggesting the Miller kids had anything to do with his 2 rabbits' mysterious disappearance. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have doubted the both of you. Your mother told my mum you'd never steal my rabbits. But I did know you wanted more rabbits, so I guess I thought you'd taken 2 of mine. I mean, your mum does refuse to buy you any more rabbits, and I knew you were jealous with me having so many. But I should have known you wouldn't do something like this. But of course we wouldn't," said Simon. At this point, Simon's mother, Janice Miller, came over to Boris with a bright, sunny smile on her face. "I'm very sorry, Boris, to hear that 2 of your rabbits are missing. I want to assure you that neither Simon or James would ever take your rabbits. I've raised them better than that. If they pulled a stunt like that, they'd have me to answer to, and believe me, that would not be pretty." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller, for doubting Simon and James. You're right, they'd never do something like this to me. It was just my dad, you see. He suffers from insomnia. He struggles to sleep at night. Mum says it's 'cause he's too big and needs to lose lots of weight. Anyway, last night my dad heard this weird owl hooting. My mother did too. My father was convinced someone was wandering around our yard, but nothing was there. I just figured out that maybe Simon knows the combination number of the lock of my hutch, and I just thought he might have been responsible for my rabbit's abduction. But I know I'm wrong, and I'm sorry about it."
"Of course you're wrong, Boris, but it's perfectly understandable that you reached that conclusion. But you don't need to apologize to me. I quite understand how distressing it is for you to lose 2 of your beloved rabbits. But you do have a lot of rabbits, Boris, so maybe you didn't count them properly when you put them back in the hutch after allowing them to play in the yard. I'm sure there's a perfectly innocent explanation as to why they went walkabout. You never know. You might find them if you search the wood grove thoroughly. They're not like wild rabbits that would scurry away, are they? They're tame and are used to being cuddled by human beings. And Simon and James may be many things, Boris, but they're not thieves, and they are inclined to play pranks on people that aren't funny. But this is not one of them."
"I feel very relieved to hear you say that, Mrs. Miller. I think I'll ask my mother to go into the woods to search for my missing rabbits, 'cause I'm afraid I get a bit out of breath running up and down." Simon had decided to keep the new rabbits in the old guinea pig hutch behind the yard shed for the time being, for they appeared to be very happy there. He'd move them when the coast was clear. He was sure in time things would soon settle down, and no one would be any the wiser about what he and James had done. His mother would be unlikely to notice a couple of new rabbits, for she never paid any attention to her children's rabbit hutch. So why should she start giving it attention now? Simon and James wanted to tell their mother about their paradoxical Bigfoot encounter in the woods, but if they told her of their bizarre experience, she would then want to know what they had been doing in the woodgrove at the dead of night in the very first place, which would likely lead her to horrifyingly conclude that maybe her 2 children were behind the mysterious abduction of Boris's missing rabbits. Apart from anything else, she would be convinced they were making up the story just to be dramatic and to gain some unwanted attention. As Janice Miller was cynical at the very best of times, she had a science degree behind her, even though she was a stay-at-home mother. But in Janice's very narrow view of the world, ghosts, cryptid creatures, and anything that could not be scientifically quantified, measured, or studied could not exist in our reality. So Simon and James knew very well that they'd never be able to let the cat out of the bag about what had happened to them that night, and their cryptic encounter with a male Bigfoot. Their father, although much more easygoing and relaxed, would also be unlikely to believe their story. He would think it was unlikely and made up. "That Bigfoot may have been watching us," Simon had told his brother. "But if he really wanted to hurt us, he could have done so, couldn't he? He may have been stalking us, but we would have been easy pickings for him. But when we saw him, he vanished from our sight. Maybe he had no ill will towards us after all. Still, I wouldn't want to run into him again. He scared the bejesus out of me." "I suppose you're right," said James. "But I want to tell you, Simon, that no matter how much money you pay me, I will not go into the woods at night with you again. Not like that. Because that thing was terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. And it doesn't matter how much money you pay me, I won't do it again." "I can't say I blame you, James. I share the same feelings. But don't worry, there will be no further rabbit abductions. I think 5 rabbits is quite enough for us. We don't need to have as many as Boris does." Mrs. van Rensburg. Nina van Rensburg would have done anything for Boris and her husband, whether she was willing to admit it or not. She was what was known by many doctors who deal with obese patients and their families as the classic enabler. The reason her husband Louis and son Boris were carrying so much extra weight was because she refused them absolutely nothing. She had grown significantly apprehensive of late about Louis's burgeoning waistline, especially after her most recent visit to see Dr. Lambrose, who specialized in obesity issues, to discuss her husband's ever-increasing health problems, which were getting worse and worse by the day. Louis van Rensburg suffered from high blood pressure and diabetes, as well as very poor circulation in his lower legs, which had caused for him some edema and a host of skin infections that were not pretty and didn't appear to be going away. Dr. Lambrose was a young man in his early 30s, but he didn't sugarcoat the truth and was very clear about Mr. van Rensburg's worsening condition.
"I understand, Mr. van Rensburg, that you were an excellent wrestler at one point in time. But I hope you're not eating the calories that you did back then, because you're a non-active man these days, and your body's demands for energy expenditure are dramatically reduced. So any excess that you consume will automatically be stored as fat. The excess weight that you are wearing is because you're eating too much, and it's doing you no favors, Mr. Rensburg, especially not to your health. Once you lose the weight, Mr. van Rensburg, your health will significantly improve, and the good news is you'll be able to go off your medications. You need to cut back drastically on the snacking and have 3 healthy meals a day, focusing on protein and vegetables. You need to eliminate sugars and fats from your diet. Do you understand?"
Louis van Rensburg looked utterly miserable at the doctor's revelation.
"But Doc, I don't like salad, nor do I like vegetables, with the exception of potatoes and corn. I like my burgers and my chips. I don't want to eat all this healthy stuff. It's boring." That is what all my patients tend to say, Mr. van Rensburg. Their palates have grown used to fatty, very sweet food that is full of preservatives. When you're used to eating food low in nutrient density like this, your body is going to be naturally hungry, as it is not being properly fed, because it's malnourished, even though it's overweight. The body will send misleading hunger signals. So that's why you continue to eat, because it's looking for those micronutrients that are lacking in your food. I want to assure you, Mr. van Rensburg, that after 21 days of eating cleaner, you won't want to go back to your old habits, even though that might be hard to believe. When you start shedding that weight, you will feel and look so much better. In the beginning, the changes might appear boring, but Mr. van Rensburg, you have a lot of weight you need to lose. You are morbidly obese, and with that comes many health complications. But Dr. Lambrose, interjected Mrs. van Rensburg, Lewis has a very slow metabolism. That's why he is the size he is. He can't help it. His mother was absolutely enormous. You should have seen the size of her. I think Lewis takes after her. I think you will find that genetics plays a very little role in the obesity epidemic that I'm currently seeing. People are making poor choices. That is why they are fat. It's as simple as that. You don't want your husband, Mrs. van Rensburg, losing his life because of his weight, do you? What are you implying, Dr. Lambrose? Are you saying that Lewis is dying? Oh, goodness gracious me, please don't say that. He's not dying, is he? Of course I'm not dying, love. Don't overreact. Your husband will die, Mrs. van Rensburg, much earlier than he should, if he carries on the way he is at the moment. I don't know how to get through to you, Mrs. van Rensburg, but your husband Lewis, if he continues to stay at the current weight he is, will have a shortened lifespan, and I'm sure you don't want that for him. So, yes, if you want to put it like that, he is slowly dying, living the way he is at the moment. Are you saying he could die? Asked Mrs. van Rensburg, her jaw dropping open in horror. Just because he eats too much? That's not right. Of course he could die from any amount of diseases that obesity causes, from diabetes to high blood pressure, sleep apnea, infections, and the list goes on and on. But the good news is we can fix this. But you're going to have to be very strict with your husband, Mrs. van Rensburg. You cannot give in to your husband's every whim. My advice to you is to not keep any tempting foods in the pantry or refrigerator that might prove irresistible to your husband. I know your son Boris is also extremely overweight, Mrs. van Rensburg, so I'm relying on you to be the one in the family that nips this in the bud once and for all. You don't want to become an enabler, do you? Most people who are obese have someone in the household that is giving in to their every need, which serves to exacerbate the problem, as no one wants to take responsibility for it. But I'm hoping, Mrs. van Rensburg, I can trust in you to take care of this problem. Well, of course I don't want to be an enabler, Dr. Lambrose, said Mrs. van Rensburg, her heart wilting at the very idea of saying no to her husband and son about anything. She loved spoiling the both of them very much, and giving them their heart's desires. But if what she was doing could ultimately kill the both of them, she would have to adopt a tough approach on their eating habits from now on. But it was going to be extremely hard, for she loved the both of them so very much. But Dr. Lambrose had confirmed her very worst fears. She was going to have to start saying no to her husband and son, and it was not going to be easy. It was after the visit to Dr. Lambrose that Nina van Rensburg had decided to toughen up significantly. So when Boris had come to her to tell his mother to please go looking for his 2 missing rabbits that might have joined the wild rabbits in the woods, as he wasn't fit enough to do it himself, Mrs. van Rensburg surprised herself by saying no to him. The word no, coming from Nina van Rensburg's lips, was so alien to Boris that his mouth simply dropped open, rather like a Venus flytrap, and his double chins jiggled in shock. Had he heard right? Had he? His mother had refused his request. That had never happened to him before. But, Mum, you've got to go into the woods. I'm sure my 2 rabbits are there. If you see them hopping around, you can catch them for me. They're tame. They'll come to you. And then you can bring them back and put them in their hutch. What part of the word no don't you understand, Boris? Said Nina van Rensburg, surprising herself by being so tough on her son, and putting up some resistance to his requests, something she'd never done before. But, Ma'am, I get tired running around the woods. How old are you, Boris? Asked Mrs. van Rensburg, pressing her lips tightly together, and suddenly looking extremely formidable, so much so that Boris did a double take. He had never expected his mother before to look like this, and it had made his knees wobble uneasily. She looked more fearsome than Janice Miller next door, which really was saying something.
I'm 10.5 years old, Mum. I'm nearly 11. You know that already. So why are you asking me such a stupid question?
You are 10 years old, Boris, and you're so fat and so desperately unfit that you can't do something as simple as go walking in the woods looking for your rabbits. It's not normal for a 10-year-old boy to be physically impaired like this. You're not handicapped, are you? But you're behaving as if you are. I blame myself for giving in to your every whim. From now on, there will be no more Boston cream pies, and definitely no more tapioca pudding. I'm going to insist you do some exercise to get yourself fit again. And you can start by going into the woods and looking for those rabbits yourself. I'm sorry, love, but I'm not going to help you. You need to do this yourself. If you don't find your 2 missing rabbits, I will not replace them for you. 18 rabbits is more than enough. You don't need 20 anyway.
Why are you being mean, Mum?
Because I love you, that's why. And I'm determined that you and your father are going to reinvent yourselves. From now on, I'm going to be very strict, as Janice Miller from next door is also strict with her children. So, like her, there'll be no sugar in this house, and you'll thank me one day for this. I can promise you of that.
I'll never thank you, Mum, because you're horrible, really horrible, and I hate you. I really hate you.
That's not a nice thing to say to your mother, said Mrs. van Rensburg. Now go on to the woodgrove and find those missing rabbits of yours. I'm not going to do it for you. I'm sorry, but I'm not. Boris van Rensburg was far from amused. What had got into his mother? Why had she come down on him like a ton of bricks? Ever since his 2 rabbits had gone missing from his rabbit hutch, and his mother had taken his father for a medical with Dr. Lambrose, she had returned home looking so formidable. He had seen her open the cupboards and toss away all the nice things in their household into black bin liners, and she had dropped them off at a children's home, all that lovely food. Now she was turning into a monster, so much so that he and his father were not warming to her at all. What had got into his mother, he wondered. He was hoping it was a passing phrase, and that his mother would be back to herself soon enough, and serving him up gluttonous portions of tapioca pudding. In fact, Boris would go so far as to say that Janice Miller from next door was looking like a much nicer, more amenable mother than his own mother right now. He never thought he'd ever think that. Why was his mother being so mean? Last night they'd eaten meat and 2 veg for dinner, and his father had stormed off in a huff, complaining that the food had been so bland. His mother had confiscated the takeaway that Louis had sneakily ordered, behind his wife's back. She had given it to Chloe, their yellow Labrador, which was so annoying. And Chloe had gobbled it all down. It looked as if their dog was eating better than they were right now, and it made him sick to his stomach. It absolutely wasn't fair. His mother kept saying she was being hard on them because she loved them so much and wanted them to live a long time. But if living a long life meant eating broccoli and dried chicken breasts, then it would be a joyless life for sure. If that wasn't bad enough, his mother was refusing to replace his 2 missing rabbits, and they were lightly bounding around the woodgrove with the wild rabbits, so he needed to find them. At first he had been so sure that Simon and James had been responsible for pinching his rabbits. He would not have put anything past Simon, as he knew how passionate Simon was about rabbits. It had given him great satisfaction to see how green at the gills Simon had become, after he'd shown them his superior rabbit enclosure and his 20 brand-new rabbits that his mother had purchased for him. Simon had gone on and on about how unfair it was that Boris had 20 rabbits, and he and his brother James only had 3. So was it any wonder that Boris had doubted the Miller kids, and believed that they had crept out of their house in the middle of the night and surreptitiously kidnapped a couple of his rabbits? I mean, even his own father had been awoken to some strange hooting sounds during the night, and had felt certain that someone was wandering around their backyard. So he wondered if it had been Simon and James, but they had both insisted that they would never steal his 2 rabbits. Simon had been so genuine when he had said this that Boris had believed him at once. So he had concluded that he had clearly not counted his rabbits correctly
when he had replaced them in their hutch, after giving them a run around his backyard. Even though Boris was unfit, he was determined to find his 2 missing rabbits. He was very annoyed that his mother was not searching for them on his account, but she seemed to have turned on him like a rabid wild animal, and was suddenly depriving him of all the good things that life had to offer. At one time he considered himself pretty fortunate to have a mother he could twist around his little finger. He had been spoilt rotten as a result, but in the last day or so, his mother's attitude had shifted exponentially. She was no longer easy to manipulate. Indeed, this morning she'd made him make his own bed for the first time in ages, clean out his bathtub, and put his clothes away very neatly in the closet. And if that was not bad enough, after breakfast he'd been expected to put away the dirty dishes in the dishwasher, which had been an exhausting business for him. Boris was not in a good mood. He felt bitterly resentful towards his mother for being so unobliging. He heaved his substantial bulk down the woodland trail, looking around for his lost rabbits. He was wheezing and gasping for breath. That was how unfit he was, but he was so determined to find the rabbits he had lost. If he didn't do it, his 2 rabbits might be gone for good, especially if they got comfortable with the wild rabbits. Boris knew he was fat, and he didn't need people to tell him he was in bad shape. He was reminded of his ever-increasing waistline every single day of his life. He hated the way he was bullied at school by everyone, and how some of the boys made fun of him for his mere size. He always told anybody that would listen that he had a metabolism problem, but the truth was no one really knew how much Boris ate behind the scenes, and he would eat almost as much as his father. He wasn't involved in sports at his school, as his mother had told them that his son had a medical condition, which meant he didn't have to do sports, and that wasn't exactly true. She had now just told him she had contacted the local school to tell them that Boris was now able to return to sports, and would be fit enough to do so. Now Boris would be forced to run around the field, gasping for breath and sweating profusely, so the kids would tease him all the more, calling him all those cruel names like Blubberface, Pork Pie, Jelly Belly, Porker, and Waddling Boris. Why had his mother done this to him? He was bullied enough already, and if he returned to the sports field, everybody would laugh at him as he waddled around, trying desperately to kick a ball, with very little success. How could his mother betray him like this? He was sure that Mrs. Miller from next door was influencing his mother. She was always telling her that Boris was far too spoilt, and that she needed to do something about his weight problem before it got out of control.
You know what they say, Nina, he had overheard her telling his mother. Obese children turn into obese adults. Do you realize giving in to all his temptations means that you're practicing child abuse? That's what it is.
Boris knew it was all nonsense, of course, but Janice Miller seemed to influence his mother very negatively these days, and he didn't like it one single bit, but there was not a jot he could do about it. It didn't help that Dr. Lambrose had laid into his mother, claiming that he and his father's lives would be dramatically shortened if they continued to eat so much. Boris now hated Dr. Lambrose almost as much as he hated Janice Miller, and now his mother was as bad as they were. It would seem for Boris, taking this leisurely walk in the woods, looking for his missing rabbits, was more than he'd bargained for. His legs were aching as he stumbled awkwardly down the woodland trails. Where were his rabbits, he wondered? It was a beguiling afternoon, with the sun prettily trickling through the trees and inviting its warmth to caress Boris's shoulders. But heaving his weighty girth around was making him work up quite a sweat, and the sweat was now pouring down his forehead and dribbling down his back, so that his T-shirt was sticking to him very uncomfortably. Any normal person would have appreciated the prettiness of the woodgrove that day, but Boris didn't notice any of it. He would so much prefer being indoors, reading a comic, watching Netflix, and tucking into a big bag of Cheetos. He felt incredibly annoyed with his mother for laying down so many stringent rules, when in the past she had let him have anything he wanted. All of a sudden, Boris was delighted to see a couple of grey rabbits running down the trail. He felt his heart lift. They were wild rabbits, of course, but maybe his 2 tame rabbits were hanging around them. On seeing him, the wild rabbits scurried away very quickly. But Boris picked up speed, his breath becoming raspy, and for a moment his head began to spin, and he felt as if he might pass out. He held on to a tree branch to stabilize himself and prevent his body from keeling over and collapsing from the strain of such vigorous excursion. He stood still briefly for a moment and took in some deep breaths. All of a sudden he heard what he could only describe as a couple of snorts. The sound reminded him of the noise Russell Ingram made in class when he laughed at something, but he knew this wasn't coming from Russell, as Russell was not in his midst. So then who was it? Was someone actually laughing at him, he wondered? His self-conscious radar was now standing up to attention, as Boris was well used to the boys at school making fun of him. But who was there, he wondered. "Is anybody there?" he called out, but the snorting sound had suddenly just stopped. And all he could hear were the sounds of the birds tweeting in the trees. Had he imagined the snorting, he wondered? Once again a couple of wild rabbits crossed his path, so he began running towards them, and the snorting started up again. Someone was definitely laughing at him. Boris was sure of it. This was not funny. "Who's there?" he called out, but the woodgrove did not betray its secrets, for the snorting stopped, and the chirruping sounds of the bird song continued. Boris was sweating profusely. He felt absolutely awful. His head was thumping. He was violently hungry, so he discreetly pulled out of his pocket a packet of oatmeal and raisin cookies that he had successfully managed to hide from his mother. If he had a little bit of sugar in him, he'd feel so much better. He could do with the added energy right now. He sat down on the earthen floor, still heaving from exhaustion. It was good to get the weight off his feet, and for his whole body to be cushioned by the soft leaves that were scattered liberally across the forest floor. His chubby fingers eagerly opened up the packet of cookies with an enthusiastic haste, as if there was an urgency to cram a cookie into his mouth. These were his absolute favourite, and at least without his mother around, he could have the sugar fix he'd been longing for all morning. He put down the packet of cookies on the forest floor beside him and took one out. He would eat it ever so slowly, so he could enjoy the flavours, and it would last longer that way. He took a bite, and his mouth was filled with the flavour of oatmeal, raisin, and caramel. It was so good. He was about to reach for another cookie when he'd finished the first one, but when he looked for the packet, it had all but gone. What was going on? Boris looked around and could not find his oatmeal and raisin cookie package anywhere. Where had it got to, when it had been there moments before? "Who stole my cookies?" came Boris's indignant voice, but no one answered him, and the woodgrove appeared to have become quiet. But Boris could not shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He wasn't afraid, but frustrated that his cookies had been taken, and he was starting to lose interest in finding the two missing rabbits, for the physical exertion of looking for them had sucked his energy reserves completely dry. He'd go back home now and abandon this trip. He was absolutely exhausted. As he walked across the fallen leaves of the earthen floor, he was certain he was being surreptitiously followed. He turned around, but nothing was there. Then it suddenly dawned on him that maybe James and Simon from next door were in the woodgrove playing tricks on him. That must be it. They were the ones that had stolen his cookies. Come to think of it, Simon did have a snort when he laughed, similar to the sound he had only just heard. Boris was now not amused. All his life he'd been the victim of fun-making because of his weight, but Simon and James playing this trick on him when he was going through a tough time already was just too much for him, and he could feel the anger festering inside him. "Simon! James! You think this is funny, do you? I know you're playing tricks on me. It's not funny." And with that he kicked up the leaves angrily as he stomped back along the woodland path. All of a sudden the cookie packet he was missing appeared to have become airborne and landed at his feet. He picked it up, but there were no cookies left inside it. He turned around expecting to see Simon and James chuckling to themselves as they were cramming cookies into their mouth and possibly hiding behind a nearby tree. But that was not what he saw. Standing before him was a humongous male Bigfoot, towering at possibly 8 to 9 foot tall, and covered in long flowing dark hair, and looking at him with dark, mischievous eyes that twinkled with humour. The Bigfoot was chewing the last one of his cookies. Boris's jaw dropped wide open. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had never been so affrighted in all his life, and all he could do was try to run, on legs that were wobbling beneath him. He could hear the snorting sound behind him. The Bigfoot must be laughing at him, he thought. When Boris turned around briefly, he was shocked to see the Bigfoot was imitating his wheezing and puffing, as if he was making fun of him, much like the boys at school did. This was all too much for Boris, and he reached the house, bolting through the front door, wheezing and gasping for breath, and nearly falling over. His mother stood in the doorway, not looking remotely amused.
"What is that in your hand, Boris?"
she asked, snatching the cookie packet from her son's hands that he didn't even realize he was still holding.
"I thought I told you, no more snacking. Why are you eating these? Where did you get them from? I thought I threw this all away."
"Ma'am, I've just seen a Bigfoot in the woods. The Bigfoot ate my cookies. I only had one of them," he told her earnestly. Nina van Rensburg looked at her son in disgust.
"Ah, there you go again, Boris. Excuses, 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 and so many fanciful ones. You're not going to take the responsibility, are you, for eating the cookies? And I know where you got these from. You stole them from the bin liners I took to the children's home. How could you? I thought I told you no more snacking. Don't you dare play the innocent with me. And as for blaming so-called Bigfoot for eating the cookies, I've heard everything now. You should be ashamed of yourself. You make up things as you go along, but it doesn't wash with me anymore. I'm tired of your lying to me and manipulating me in the way you do. Very tired of it."
"But, Ma'am, I'm not lying. There was a Bigfoot in the woods. He took the cookies. He was following me. He was making fun of me. I only ate one of the cookies, I promise you."
"Oh, please, change the record, will you, Boris? Look at the state of you. You're sweating like a pig. You're so desperately unfit. It's shocking for a boy your age to be so out of shape. Dr. Lambrose was right about everything. I've been an enabler, and it stops right now. If I find you with any more oat and raisin cookies, there'll be hell to pay. And I will confiscate your pocket money for the entire year. And I'm not joking either. Is that understood?"
"Yes, Ma'am."
"Good. I'm glad I've made myself clear. Did you find the rabbits you were looking for by any chance? By the looks of you, I sincerely doubt it."
"I couldn't find them anywhere, Ma'am. Will you get me another too, please?"
"Absolutely not, Boris. I know I'm coming down on you hard, but things have got to change around here. I've been a pushover for far too long. You are responsible for looking after your rabbits. If 2 of them go missing, it's on you. One day you're going to be a grown-up man, and you won't have me to bail you out every time you have a shortfall of some kind. You're going to need to take responsibility for yourself. I've allowed you to get away with far too much for far too long, which is why you are the size you are currently. Simon and James Miller from next door do hundreds of chores around their house, I'm told. They chop firewood for their father. They do the washing for their mother. They take it in turns to do the chores around the house. They go out with their father on sports excursions and get involved in school sports. And look how healthy they both are. I blame myself for what you have become. You're lazy, entitled, and extremely selfish, and furthermore you're a liar. Your father is not much different, but he doesn't lie. Well, I suppose he does when it comes to food. But things are going to change around here, because I want you and your dad around for a long time, believe it or not."
"You want us around, do you? Well, if you do, we're going to both be miserable."
"I don't think you'll be miserable for very much longer,"
said Nina van Rensburg with a twinkle in her eyes.
"Imagine if all the bullying at school stops if you lose the weight. And what about when you're older and you start dating? Do you think a pretty girl will give you a second glance if you're a great big fatty? I don't think so."
"I don't want to date girls," said Boris furiously. "And just so you know, I wasn't making it up about the Bigfoot. I saw it in the woodgrove. It was laughing at me. It stole my cookies."
"I've had enough nonsense from you. Go and wash yourself, you stink. And just so you know, tonight you're going to have chicken breast, broccoli and salad for dinner."
"I hate you, Mum. You're horrible. You're the worst mum in the whole world. Even Janice Miller is better than you. And that's saying something," said Boris, storming to his bedroom in disgust, wondering what on earth had happened to the mother who he could so easily twist around his little finger. He did not like this new version of his mother, and he was so sick of eating all this healthy food. All he could think about was tasting a juicy burger with chips, followed by bowlfuls of the creamiest tapioca pudding. But those thoughts only made his hunger 1,000 times worse. Janice Miller. Back at the Miller household, Janice Miller was absolutely convinced that her 2 children had nothing to do with the disappearance of Boris's 2 rabbits. She knew she had brought up her 2 children to be the pillars of society. Nina van Rensburg was impressed with the way she had raised her 2 boys, and was taking pointers from her to be a better mother to Boris. Yet despite the fact that Janice Miller was convinced that her 2 boys could have nothing to do with the abduction of the 2 rabbits that belonged to Boris, there was something that was giving her pause for thought, and was niggling at her, like an inner voice telling her to pay attention. When Janice was cleaning the living room that morning, to her horror she found a muddy footprint on the window ledge that looked as if it belonged to one of her boys. The window was wide open, and she realized that her sons would be able to wiggle through it if they wanted to, and the only thing she could think about was the possibility her children had used the window to sneak out of the house during the night. And for what? The telltale marks had not been there the day before. She had remembered how James's face had paled when she told them that she had reassured Nina van Rensburg that her kids would never ever take Boris's 2 rabbits. But now, with the telltale muddy footprint weighing on her mind, she was beginning to doubt her earnest protestations of their innocence. Could it be that her 2 perfect boys, that she emphatically believed would never do anything treacherously deceitful, had been lying to her all along? Supposing they had stolen 2 of Boris's rabbits. But they wouldn't do that, Janice assured herself firmly. Not my sons. Yet when she told herself this, she could feel the nausea welling up in the back of her throat, as a little voice whispered, "Why not your sons? What makes you think they're so perfect? Where do you think that muddy footprint on the window ledge comes from? Don't be so delusional, Janice. Wake up, will you?" Janice threw down her duster, and with hands trembling and a heart suspended in her throat, she went off to search for Boris's rabbits. If her kids were hiding them on the property, she would find them. Janice thought about the old guinea pig enclosure behind the yard shed, and thought it would be the perfect place to hide the stowaway bunny rabbits. "They're not there," she told herself firmly. "My 2 sons would never take Boris's rabbits." But when Janice Miller ventured behind the yard shed and stared at the guinea pig enclosure, what did she find but 2 of Boris's rabbits chomping away happily into some romaine lettuce. Janice stared at the rabbits in disbelief. She growled under her breath, "I will kill them when they get home. I will kill them. See if I don't. My sons stole Boris's rabbits and lied to me straight to my face. When they get home from school today, they are going to wish that they were never born." When Simon and James returned home from school that afternoon, after having been dropped up the road by the yellow school bus, they had no idea what awaited them in the kitchen, and they were in for a rude awakening that they had not seen coming. The boys knew at once that they were in trouble, by the expression on Janice's face that told them that they were very much in the dog box, as both boys knew how their mother behaved when she wasn't happy, and her whole face was like a stormy day. Simon and James surreptitiously exchanged warning glances between each other. Their mother had not laid out any sandwiches for them, as she usually did. The breakfast nook in the kitchen was barren. There was nothing warmly welcoming about the kitchen this afternoon. "We're in trouble," Simon whispered to his brother. "Mummy's pissed about something, really pissed. I can see it in her face."
"I think you boys have something to tell me, don't you?"
and I'd like to hear it," she said with an expression of grave disappointment on her face. "What do you mean, Mum?" asked James innocently. Janice Miller shook her short head of tightly cropped black curls furiously.
"Oh, no, you don't," she said indignantly. "Don't you dare play the innocent with me. I know."
"What do you know, Mum?"
"I know that you took Boris's 2 rabbits. I found them both happily tucking into some remained lettuce in the old guinea pig enclosure that used to belong to my father. Why the hell would you steal 2 of Boris's rabbits? Do you realize what you both have done?"
"You found them, then?" asked Simon, his face paling.
"Yes, I found them, Simon. I hope you're proud of yourselves for becoming such accomplished little thieves and creeping out the lounge window in the middle of the night. Yes, I found those muddy footprints on the window ledge, which betrayed your insidious crimes to me."
"Oh, no," said Simon. "I thought we'd wiped the evidence away."
"I can't believe it, Simon. You have the audacity to say something like this. You sound like a hardened criminal. You're stealing Boris's rabbits. What will you do tomorrow if this is what you've done today? What do you have to say for yourselves? You swore blind you had nothing to do with the rabbit's disappearance, but you both lied to me."
"We didn't swear anything, Mum. You were the one that assumed we hadn't taken the rabbits. We didn't correct you on that, that's all."
"Of course I assumed you hadn't taken Boris's rabbits. You know why? Because I had faith in your integrity. I didn't raise you to both become thieves. What do you have to say for yourselves? I take it that, Simon, you're the ringleader in all of this. God knows you've been incessantly nagging me to buy you more rabbits for a long time, so it's obvious you're behind it."
"That's why we did it, Mum," said Simon defensively. "You've never been generous to us, have you? You're tight with our pocket money. And you don't pay us for any chores we do around the house. How do you think it feels to see Boris next door with over 20 rabbits, and we only have 3? Boris gets everything he wants, and Mrs. van Rensburg refuses him nothing. But when we want something, you always say no."
"So that's what this is all about, then," said Janice Miller furiously. "You were jealous that Boris had more rabbits than you, so you stole 2 from him. Do you realize how pathetic you sound?"
"It's not pathetic, Mum. We just wanted to have more than 3 rabbits, that's all." "I didn't want any more rabbits, Mum," said James. "Simon was the one that wanted 2 more rabbits. He said he'd pay me a month's worth of his pocket money if I helped him steal 2 of Boris's rabbits during the night. So I did, because I wanted to buy that vintage car I like so much."
"I don't care about whose fault this is. Both of you did this, so you're both responsible. But I care more about the fact that you both lied to me, and also that you stole 2 rabbits from our next-door neighbour. It is absolutely shocking. Shocking, to say the very least. I never thought I'd ever be ashamed of both of my boys, but I'm ashamed of both of you. You're nothing but common thieves, and you're going to be punished severely for what you've done. I wonder what Mrs. van Rensburg would have to say if she knew about this."
"You didn't tell her, Mum, did you?" asked Simon nervously.
"What do you take me for, Simon? Of course I didn't tell her. And you know why? Because I'm always proudly telling my good friend what wonderful children I have, and that you boys are of such noble character. More fool me for believing the best in my own children. I told Nina van Rensburg the 2 of you would never, and I repeat, never, steal her son's rabbits, because you're raised so very well. So I'm hardly going to pick up the phone and call my friend and say, 'Oh, hello, Nina, how are you? I was wrong about my sons. They're a couple of common thieves, and yes, they did steal your son's rabbits. Oh, by the way, all the stuff about my kids having integrity is a bold-faced lie. Do you think I'm going to tell her that? I don't think so."
"So then we can keep the rabbits, can we, Mum?" asked Simon hopefully.
"I can't believe you got the brazen audacity to ask me such a thing, Simon," said Janice Miller, looking appalled. "No, you cannot keep Boris's rabbits under any circumstances. Do you hear me? What don't you get about this? You stole 2 of Boris's rabbits, so I'm going to have to return them to him. You're going to give me the combination number of the lock for the hatch, and I'm going to place the rabbits back in the hutch where they belong. I'm going to have to sneak out of the house in the middle of the night to accomplish this endeavour, as the 2 of you have brought me down to your level. But I have to make a right out of this dreadful wrong. As for the 2 of you, well, there's going to be no pocket money for the next month. Do you understand? You're lucky I'm coming down on you so lightly. I was thinking of confiscating your pocket money for an entire year. Stealing of any kind is not acceptable. I don't care if Boris owns 20 Rolls Royces and walks around with a wallet stuffed with hundreds of dollars. You don't even take anything from someone, even if they've got an excess of whatever it may be.
Ma'am, you mustn't go into the woods at night. There's a Bigfoot in the woods there. We saw it. We were very scared of it.
Oh, nice try, Simon. I don't buy that for a second. A Bigfoot in the woods? Your elaborate lies are so far-fetched and over the top. And you'll do anything and say anything, won't you? To keep those rabbits. But it's not going to happen. I'm sorry, those rabbits are going back to Boris, whether you like it or not. I'm so desperately disappointed in the both of you. You're lucky I haven't told your father about this. And you know why?
Why? Asked Simon, going white.
Because I don't want your father losing faith in you like I have done. He'd be devastated to know what you've done, and very ashamed, and I don't want to put him through that.
Ma'am, you're making it sound as if we've robbed some old ladies of their life savings. We stole 2 of Boris's bunny rabbits, only because he has too many of them.
I don't care how many rabbits Boris has got. It doesn't make what you did right. If I had 10 cars parked in the garage and Mrs. van Rensburg next door thought I had too many, do you think she has a right to take one of them? I don't think so.
This is different, Mum, said Simon. Rabbits aren't cars.
What are you not getting about any of this, Simon? Stealing is wrong, and those rabbits are going straight back to the van Rensburgs. And my decision is final. I'm going to put them back myself where they belong. The last thing I want to do is to admit to Mrs. van Rensburg that my 2 sons are nothing more than common thieves. I also don't want your friendship with Boris to blow apart and become impaired. If he thinks you have stolen his 2 rabbits, it'll be very distressing for him to think that 2 of his best friends could do such a wicked thing. In normal circumstances, I would want you to apologize to him for what you've done. But instead you're going to buy him some nice things with your pocket money that you won't be getting this month. You can think of something he'd like and buy it for him, as way of compensation for what you've done.
But Boris is going to think it's odd if we buy him a present, James insisted.
You can tell him you bought him a gift to encourage him to be successful in his endeavours. I think that would be a very nice thing to do.
But, Mum, giving Boris a gift will mean absolutely nothing to him. Mrs. van Rensburg gives him everything he ever wants. He just has to say the word tapioca pudding, and his mum is at his side, giving him platefuls of the stuff, and I'm not exaggerating.
Not any more, said Janice Miller, shaking her head firmly. I think you will find Mrs. van Rensburg has changed. She took her husband to see Dr. Lambrose the other day. He told her that obesity kills, and her husband and son might have a reduced lifespan. And let's just say that was a wake-up call for her. She's thrown all the treats out of the house, and she's told me that both Boris and Louis are in cantankerous moods at the moment because she won't give in to their every whim. I'm extremely proud of her accomplishments. She told me that Boris stole a packet of oatmeal and raisin cookies the other day, and when she caught him, he claimed a Bigfoot had eaten the packet. So I'm afraid your Bigfoot excuses just don't wash with me, nor do they wash with Nina, who wasn't fooled for a second. If you want to make elaborate excuses, you boys should be a little bit more realistic with them.
Both James and Simon knew about Boris's Bigfoot encounter, as he had told them about it, but they had been unable to share their own with him, as that would mean admitting to him that they had stolen his 2 rabbits. They had told Boris they believed his account, but they couldn't believe he had been foolish enough to tell his mother that a Bigfoot had eaten his cookies. That was going too far, even though it was true, of course. Mrs. van Rensburg crept out of her house at the dead of night, taking care not to wake up her husband. She had crumbled a couple of antihistamines into his cocoa that were renowned for making one very drowsy, and they had worked a treat on her husband, for he was out like a light. She felt exceedingly guilty about not telling him about what the boys had done in stealing 2 of Boris's rabbits, but she didn't have the heart to tell him, because he'd be so disappointed in them. Once Janice Miller was out of the house, she could see that it was a reasonably light night, with a full moon indiscriminately casting its bright illumination over the yard, which meant the night appeared to be unambiguously wearing a nonchalant, easy-going ambience. Janice was not the kind of woman intimidated by very much. She was made of tough stuff. She was practical, efficient, and headstrong, and her undivided focus tonight was getting this job done and returning Boris's rabbits to their rightful enclosure, where they obviously belonged. She was exceedingly annoyed with her 2 boys for forcing her to do this clandestine night-time operation, which made her feel like an insidious burglar, but there really was no other way to sort this problem out. She was not going to encourage her children to keep stolen property that did not belong to them, but this was one of the most difficult returns she had ever had to make. Her 2 boys were out of order, and needed to learn the hard way that no one got rewarded for doing something that was underhanded and wrong. She knew Simon got ridiculously mushy over bunny rabbits, and she couldn't for the life of her understand why her son was not happy with 3 bunny rabbits. Wasn't that enough? The problem was Nina van Rensburg from next door had overspoilt Boris, giving him so many more rabbits than her own children possessed, and it had made them feel hard done by, and in a way she could understand that. But stealing 2 of Boris's rabbits was an unacceptable thing for her boys to do. Simon had given his mother the combination lock for the van Rensburg rabbit enclosure, so with the 2 rabbits tucked in the cat carrier, Janice cautiously made her way down the woodland trails towards the van Rensburg backyard. She had thought a casual walk through the woods to the van Rensburg property would be pretty straightforward, but nothing could be further from the truth. The night wore an unsettling, inauspicious ambience, so as Janice scurried awkwardly down the trails, she was overcome with a profound sense of foreboding, a sense that she was not alone, that someone was watching her. She turned around very quickly to survey the woods, to ensure that nothing was there, but the woods gave nothing away. The tall, lofty silhouettes of the trees were enshrouded in a veil of such extreme darkness that everything was indistinguishable. Janice's torch lit up the path ahead of her, while she held on to the cat carrier for dear life. She was hit with the overwhelming sense that something was definitely there, that something was watching her, but every time her eyes cast their gaze across the grove, she saw absolutely nothing. "What's wrong with me?" she thought to herself. "Get a grip! Nothing is there!" And that was when she saw him. And there are no words. Janice thought she had to be dreaming, so she quickly closed her eyes and opened them again, and there he was, watching her. Oh my God, he was enormous, easily 8 to 9 foot tall, and covered in dark hair, darker than the night itself. Janice was seeing a Bigfoot. For a moment Janice locked eyes with the male Bigfoot, and was astounded by how human he appeared to be. He nodded at her, almost as if he was saying hello, and then he just walked casually away, almost as if crossing paths with Janice was a completely normal thing to do. Janice was so completely terrified, she ran through the woods as fast as she could, towards the van Rensburg house. When she reached the house, she ran to their front door and began beating it loudly. It was 2:30 in the morning. All of a sudden the lights in the van Rensburg household went on. Moments later, Nina van Rensburg, with her husband Louis at her side, opened the front door. She looked bemused to see Janice Miller standing there, with wide, frightened eyes, carrying a cat carrier in her hands.
"What on earth are you doing here, Janice, at this time of night?"
Nina asked, guiding her friend into the house.
"Something's out there," said Janice. "Something was following me here. I'm not going out there again. I'm just not."
Louis van Rensburg frowned.
"What the hell are you doing here at this time of night?" he asked. "Do you realize what time it is?"
Janice had to think quickly on her feet.
"Well, I couldn't sleep tonight, could I? Wouldn't you believe it? I saw your 2 rabbits. 2 of Boris's rabbits hopping around our lawn in the middle of the night. I knew at once they were Boris's because they were so tame. So I put them in the cat box and brought them to you at once. I couldn't believe what a stroke of good luck it was that I was able to spot them like that. And as I was up and about, I thought I'd take a casual walk to the woods and bring them back to you. I had to get them back to you at once. I know you've been so worried about their whereabouts. It's very kind of you to think about Boris. But couldn't you have waited for the morning, Janice? Asked Nina, looking surprised. I'm sure Boris will be thrilled to have his rabbits back. But your coming over here at the dead of night and walking down that trail is ludicrous. It's very dark out there, very intimidating and frightening. And you walked all the way. Are you insane? At the very least, if you came over to our house, shouldn't you have driven here? I just knew how upset poor Boris was about his missing 2 rabbits. I wanted him to get them back as soon as possible. So I decided to come at once. But I don't want to go out there again. It felt like something was following me. I know you think I'm being dramatic. I'm not normally frightened of the dark, but something was there. I know it was. Look, Janice, me and Nina, we fully appreciate you being so considerate in bringing Boris's rabbits back. But Nina is right. You woke us up at this crazy hour of the night. You should really have left it until the morning. But I tell you what I'll do, I'll drive you back home. There's no way I want you wandering around in the darkness like this. It's crazy. No wonder you're so affrighted. Oh, I'm so embarrassed, said Janice. You're absolutely right. What was I thinking coming out to your property at this insane hour, when I could have left it until the morning? Nina van Rensburg kept her lips tightly pursed together. She wasn't fooled for a single second. She realized at once that Janice's kids had probably stolen Boris's rabbits, and Mrs. Miller, who believed her 2 boys were cherubs, had discovered their grisly crime, and to cover for them, had surreptitiously tried to return the rabbits in the middle of the night. But something had gone wrong, and frightened her so very much that she'd banged on their front door, and made some farcical excuse about needing to return Boris's rabbits at such an insane hour of the night. Nina smiled to herself, feeling a sense of gratification that Janice's 2 boys were not so perfect after all. But she wouldn't let Janice know that she knew exactly what was going on. To cut a long story short, the 2 Miller children gave Boris van Rensburg a very nice present that they brought with their pocket money that had been confiscated from them. And Boris said to them, "Well, I'd better give you something in return, shouldn't I? How about I give you 2 of my bunny rabbits, the 2 that went missing? I'm sure you'd like them." "You'd give us your bunny rabbits?" asked Simon, looking surprised. "I thought you were so proud of having 20. "Well, I figured that since your rabbits went missing, and your mother found them wandering around your lawn at the dead of night, that they must want to be with you rather than with me. So they're yours. Besides, I have far too many rabbits. If you want to thank anyone, thank my mother. It was her idea for me to give you the rabbits. She pointed out that they were found wandering around your property." Simon and James went to seek Mrs. van Rensburg to thank her for the rabbits. "You'll never know what it means to us to have these 2 bunny rabbits, Mrs. van Rensburg," Simon said excitedly, very glad that they would legitimately be able to keep the 2 rabbits. "Word of advice, Simon," said Mrs. van Rensburg. "If you really want something, it's always better to ask. I do believe I know how very much you want those rabbits. Boris has too many. It was no skin off his nose to give you 2 of them." In that moment, Simon felt rather like the emperor wearing no clothes, almost as if everyone had uncovered their dirty secret, but he didn't care any more. He was so delighted to have the bunny rabbits that he loved so much, and had cost him and his brother so much in terms of courage and conviction, for they had faced what seemed like real adversity to get their hands on those rabbits. Simon and James never forgot the story of how they encountered the Bigfoot in the woods that had terrified the both of them half to death. Boris had also had a bizarre encounter and had been freaked out by it.
Mrs. Miller had thought her children's claims that they had encountered a Bigfoot in the middle of the night on their intrepid adventure had been highly exaggerated, until she had encountered the Bigfoot herself, when she was delivering the rabbits safely back to their enclosure. She confided in her 2 boys that after her encounter with the Bigfoot, in her panic, she had run straight to the Van Rensburg front door, and had had to make a bizarre story up about finding the rabbits wandering around their lawn. And then she told her 2 boys, "I'm afraid I don't know if Nina believed my story or not. She did give me a very funny look. But what could I do about that? I had to go to their house because I was terrified of the Bigfoot I'd seen, and I was too afraid to return home by way of the Woodgrove. So thankfully Mr. Van Rensburg agreed to give me a lift home. But I think the Van Rensburgs might know that you stole their rabbits. But you know what? I'm beyond caring about that now." The good news is that Mr. Louis Van Rensburg and his son Boris, in the weeks and months that followed, lost a considerable amount of weight. They will never go back to the mindless eating of their past, and now they're so much more mobile. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.